The stronghold of Gergovia rose dramatically above the surrounding plain, its height reaching nearly 1,200 feet. At its summit lay a broad plateau, stretching for more than a mile, forming a natural fortress that dominated the landscape. Among all possible approaches, the southern slope offered the most practical route for an attacking army, and it was here that Vercingetorix positioned his forces. As soon as Roman troops appeared in the region, mounted skirmishes became frequent across the low ground, while Gallic infantry remained safely behind their prepared defences. Caesar established his main camp to the southeast of the town. Shortly afterward, he secured a nearby hill on the southern side and fortified it as a secondary camp, linking both positions with defensive works. This manoeuvre disrupted access to the river below and placed the town's water supply under pressure. At the same time, unrest spread among the Aedui, Rome's principal allies in the region. Their army, marching to reinforce Caesar, began to show signs of rebellion. Leaving his forces before Gergovia under the command of Fabius, Caesar moved swiftly to the rear, confronted the disloyal leaders, restored order, and returned with remarkable speed. In a single day, his column of 4 legions covered roughly 50 miles. After weighing his options, Caesar resolved to attempt an assault on Gergovia. His preparations were deliberate and calculated. A diversionary force was sent against the western side of the town, a sector the Gauls believed to be weak. This manoeuvre succeeded in drawing most of the defenders away from the southern front. At that moment, Roman legions surged forward with determination and pressed all the way to the town's walls. Yet the attack had been launched without sufficient equipment. Scaling ladders were lacking, and only a few soldiers managed to reach the top. When Gallic forces rushed back from the west, the Romans were driven off with heavy losses. Caesar later attempted to soften the account of this reverse, but the outcome was unmistakable. The Aedui soon rose openly against Rome, and the siege was abandoned. Gergovia had held. The site itself lay several miles south of modern Clermont-Ferrand and stood boldly above the plain. Its summit formed a long, quadrangular plateau. The northern and eastern slopes were likely wooded in antiquity, making movement difficult for large bodies of troops. The southern side, by contrast, consisted of broad terraces that were neither steep nor heavily forested. To the west rose a neighbouring height, only slightly lower than Gergovia and connected to it by a narrow ridge. Other hills flanked the area, while a long rocky ridge lay to the south, forming a massive natural barrier below the plateau. Streams and rivers surrounded the region, shaping movement and supply routes. From the south and southeast, the town appeared most vulnerable to attack. Caesar placed his main camp on elevated and healthy ground south of a drained lake, with a river flowing behind it. Any attempt to storm Gergovia before neutralizing Vercingetorix's army was dangerous, and the accumulation of supplies was essential before any prolonged operation could be considered. Popular images of Gergovia often exaggerate its impregnability. Though the northern slope was long, it was not impossibly steep. Over centuries, cultivation may have softened the terrain, but its essential form remained unchanged. In Caesar's time, woodland likely obscured this approach, and it was not thoroughly examined. In truth, the position was less invincible than later tradition suggested, though ancient warfare imposed different limitations. Along the southern terraces, Vercingetorix arrayed his army behind a stone wall, organizing allied contingents by tribe with great care. Daily skirmishes followed, particularly involving cavalry supported by light infantry, as the Gallic commander tested and strengthened his troops. These engagements unfolded across the plains between the Roman camps and the slopes of the plateau. Caesar soon identified a nearby hill to the south as strategically vital. From this position, Gallic forces protected their access to water, grain, and forage. A small outpost guarded it, but the garrison proved insufficient. Under cover of night, Roman troops seized the hill, expelled its defenders, and quickly fortified a new camp. 2 legions occupied the position, and a secure corridor of trenches and earthworks linked it to the main camp. Archaeological traces of these works remain visible today. This move further restricted access to water, forcing the defenders to rely on springs atop the plateau and distant streams. On the northern side, no comparable pressure was applied. Meanwhile, Vercingetorix turned his attention to undermining Caesar's alliances. Through persuasion and bribery, young Aeduan nobles were led to believe that Rome intended to betray them. Even their chief leader became involved. An army assigned to guard Roman supply lines was redirected toward the Gallic cause, and Roman escorts were murdered along the route. Caesar learned of the plot at a critical moment. Leaving Gergovia once again under Fabius, he advanced rapidly with 4 legions and his cavalry, surrounded the disloyal force, and restored order through a mixture of authority and restraint. The soldiers were convinced that they had been deceived by their leaders, who fled at once. The wider Aeduan population, however, remained in turmoil. Roman residents were attacked, property was seized, and rebellion spread. Some sought reconciliation, others pressed for war. Caesar was forced to balance punishment with clemency, knowing that the loyalty of the region remained uncertain. His political and military resources were stretched to their limits. During Caesar's absence, Vercingetorix launched a determined assault on the Roman camp. The defenders, spread thin across its extensive fortifications, struggled to hold the line. Continuous Gallic attacks tested the ramparts, and only with the aid of engines and heavy losses was the position maintained. Messages reached Caesar, who hurried back with his troops after a forced march that left little margin for delay. His return prevented disaster. Not long afterward, an apparent opportunity arose. Caesar later claimed that he had already decided to withdraw and merely sought to preserve the army's honour. Yet, the evidence suggests otherwise. The attack that followed was launched in earnest, with full expectation of success. Its failure was undeniable. From the southern hill, Caesar observed that the plateau above appeared stripped of defenders. Deserters confirmed that Gallic forces had moved to secure a nearby height connected to the town by a narrow wooded ridge. Control of this position would threaten Gallic access to supplies and water. Anticipating the danger, Vercingetorix had concentrated his troops there. Caesar responded with a carefully orchestrated deception. Cavalry units were sent at night to create noise and confusion on one flank, reinforced by mule drivers disguised as soldiers. A legion took position nearby, giving the impression of an imminent assault. Observing this activity, the Gallic army shifted its strength away from the southern front to counter the perceived threat. Fortifications were hastily erected, confirming that the feint had succeeded. The maneuver was executed with precision and insight. Though the assault ultimately failed, the operation demonstrated a sophisticated understanding of terrain, deception, and enemy psychology. Even without artillery, the methods employed closely resembled those of later warfare. At Gergovia, strategy, geography, and human error combined to produce one of the rare moments where Caesar was decisively checked. Caesar had achieved what he needed from the deception. Under the cover of that distraction, the main body of his troops was shifted quietly from the larger camp to the smaller one, not in a single obvious movement, but in small groups spaced out so the enemy would not notice a sudden change. The march was concealed as much as possible. Men moved low behind cover, and anything that might flash in the sunlight or signal a transfer from afar was hidden. The goal was simple. The Gauls were watching the wrong place, and Caesar intended to strike from the one place they did not expect. Once the concentration was complete, orders were passed to the senior officers. The position ahead, Caesar warned, was not the sort of place that could be carried by sheer force. It could only be seized by catching the defenders off balance. Discipline mattered more than enthusiasm. Soldiers were not to surge forward just because they smelled victory, and they were not to break formation in pursuit of loot. If the attack dissolved into scattered groups, an organized enemy could hit them from the side and turn success into panic. The warning suggests that the ground ahead and the layout of the defences offered real dangers that might not be obvious to a man charging uphill in the heat of the moment. To deepen the confusion, the Aedui were sent out from the larger camp by a separate route, striking at a different point so the defenders would be forced to divide their attention. The town's wall stood far above and far away. Even in a straight line it was a long distance, and the land itself did not offer a clean, direct approach. The climb was shaped by ridges, folds, and uneven ground that pushed troops onto winding paths. Halfway up the ascent, the Gallic line was anchored by a stone barrier about 6 feet high. Below it, there were no Roman works, no established camps, no prepared staging areas. Above it, Gallic positions were packed closely together, their tents and shelters clustered near the higher ground that led up toward the town. Then the signal was given. The legionaries surged out of the smaller camp, moved quickly up the slope, and reached the stone barrier in a hard rush. They swarmed over it and struck the Gallic camp beyond. The blow landed cleanly. The surprise was so complete that at least one Gallic leader barely escaped in time, stumbling out of his shelter with no chance to gather himself, let alone organize a defense. For a moment, the Roman attack had achieved exactly what its planners had hoped: speed, shock, and confusion. And then something strange happened. At the very point where the momentum seemed strongest, Caesar halted. The 10th Legion, close to him, was held back. The reason remains unclear. Later, Caesar presented the action as if this limited gain had been the plan from the start, as if the goal had merely been to seize the enemy camp and then withdraw. But the situation reads differently when watched closely. From higher ground, the risks may have become more visible than they had seemed from below. The town was still above, the terrain was awkward, and the attack was already beginning to stretch forward beyond tight control. It is possible Caesar considered holding the captured position, perhaps turning it into a foothold for heavier preparations. It is also possible that, if the legions had pressed at once, the town might have been taken in the same rush that had broken into the enemy camp. Yet the recall was sounded, and Caesar tried to stop the other legions from pushing further. The problem was that a recall is only useful if it is heard and obeyed. The officers did everything they could, but the troops were carried by the intoxication of success and the expectation of plunder. Some may not have heard the trumpets clearly. The ground between Caesar and the forward units disrupted sound and sight. And even when signals were understood, men who believe they are winning rarely want to stop. The forward legions pushed on toward the town's wall, only to discover that they lacked the basic tools needed for a quick escalade. If a sudden assault had truly been intended, the absence of proper ladders was a serious failure. Yet the wall itself was so thinly defended that an astonishing scene unfolded on the ramparts. Women leaned out over the edge, pleading for mercy, already expecting the kind of massacre that had followed earlier Roman victories elsewhere. A few Romans even reached the top. A centurion from the 8th Legion was lifted up by his comrades and climbed onto the wall, with others following. The fact that men could climb at all showed that, in that brief window when defenders were absent, The town was not beyond reach, but windows like that close fast. Word raced through the Gallic positions. Vercingetorix's forces, led back by cavalry, came streaming toward the threatened point. Within moments, the open ground behind the wall filled with defenders. The mood on the ramparts flipped instantly. The same women who had been begging for mercy now turned to rally their families, urging resistance with frantic gestures and cries. The speed of the Gallic return revealed something important. The troops had not been labouring far away on distant hills. They had been close enough to rush back almost immediately. Now the Romans, extended uphill and disordered by their own success, were facing a fight in the worst possible conditions, against growing numbers on unfavourable ground, and without the equipment needed to finish the job quickly. Caesar recognised the danger and tried to stabilise the situation. Orders were sent back to bring up cohorts that had remained on guard duty in the Roman camp. They were to take a position that would threaten the Gallic flank and cover a withdrawal if the attack collapsed. Caesar himself advanced with the 10th Legion, but he kept it under tight control rather than throwing it forward into the confusion. Ahead, the other legions fought fiercely, but the balance had shifted. The Gauls were now in position and were able to strike from angles that punished the Romans' exposed side. Men who had climbed the wall were thrown back. Another centurion, trying to force an entry at the gates, was killed while attempting to save his comrades from being cut off. At the worst moment, confusion deepened on the Roman right. The Aedui, who had been sent on a separate attack, appeared on the flank. They had a distinctive way of marking themselves, but in the chaos, Roman soldiers mistook them for fresh enemy troops using a trick. The fear of being surrounded surged through the line. The withdrawal began not as a controlled step back, but with patches of disorder spreading along the slope. The losses were heavy, hundreds of men and an unusually high number of centurions. The officer casualties alone reveal what the fighting had been like at the sharp end, where leaders tried to hold units together under pressure. Even so, the retreat did not become a rout. The 10th Legion, repositioning with discipline, shielded the movement and threatened the Gallic flank often enough to discourage a full collapse. The cohorts brought up from the rear took ground that made an enemy pursuit dangerous. Once the Romans reached the plain, they turned as a body and faced their pursuers. Vercingetorix had hoped to trap them while they were stretched and vulnerable, but the sudden firmness of the Roman line changed the calculation. He chose not to gamble on a pitched fight on open ground and pulled his forces back into the town. Back in camp, Caesar addressed the legions. He criticised their recklessness, their refusal to obey signals and orders, while also acknowledging their bravery. He made the lesson blunt. Courage without restraint could destroy an army. A commander, he insisted, had to judge when risk was worth taking, and soldiers needed self-control as much as boldness. At the same time, he tried to prevent despair from spreading. One reverse, he argued, should not be mistaken for a failure of Roman fighting spirit. The disadvantages of terrain and circumstance could be as deadly as an enemy's skill. Yet Caesar could not leave with dignity after an attack that had ended this way. The next day, he drew out his army onto the plain and offered battle. Vercingetorix refused to come down from the heights, allowing only limited mounted fighting. The Romans performed well in that skirmishing. The day after, Caesar repeated the challenge, while preparing to abandon the operation. Again, the Gallic leader stayed on the high ground. With no decisive engagement available, Caesar began the withdrawal in broad daylight, deliberately visible, as if daring the enemy to try for a final strike. Vercingetorix did not pursue. The episode invites comparison with other commanders known for relentless assaults on strong positions. Some leaders forced victory through sheer tactical drive, refusing to pause once momentum had been gained. Here, Caesar's restraint or hesitation stands out. It was not the first time his men surged beyond his control, and it would not be the last. There were writers later who hinted that the affair at Gergovia was worse than Caesar allowed in his own account. Stories circulated of humiliations and narrow escapes. Whether those details were true or exaggerated, the strategic outcome was clear enough. The siege was abandoned because success could not be forced, and because a larger political emergency was unfolding behind the lines. That emergency was the Aedui. Their loyalty had become a crisis that threatened the entire Roman position in Gaul. Caesar began moving east, reached a river crossing within a few days, repaired a damaged bridge, and shifted onto the safer bank as he withdrew toward regions where he hoped to restore control. The betrayal among Aeduan leaders was now open, despite the honour and protection Rome had shown them. Their army, led by prominent nobles, drifted away toward home, and a cavalry leader rode out to stir the whole people into revolt. Caesar did not attempt to hold the wavering allies in place by force. Instead, he reminded them of a simple truth. Rome had once found them weak and exposed, and had raised them higher than any neighbouring tribe. The implication was left hanging for them to answer. But events moved faster than speeches. Caesar had stored supplies, horses, baggage, and hostages in an Aeduan town on the Loire. When the Aeduan army arrived there, they found that the leadership had already turned toward Vercingetorix and abandoned Rome. They took advantage immediately. The Roman garrison was slaughtered, traders were killed, and whatever wealth could be seized was divided among the rebels. The hostages were sent away to the Aeduan capital. Horses gathered from Italy and Spain for Roman remounts were driven off. The town itself was burned, along with stores that could not be carried. Troops were stationed at the river crossings to block the Roman army from passing. The hope was to starve Caesar into retreating south toward the Roman province, and to isolate the Roman forces operating farther north. News of this reached Caesar on the march, and it revealed how dangerous the situation had become. The Arverni were behind him, buoyed by the reverse at Gergovia. The Aedui were in front, holding the Loire crossings. Another hostile people threatened the flank. Caesar was surrounded by revolt and rising confidence. A retreat into the province would have been more than a tactical withdrawal. It would have been a political collapse that left his northern army cut off and his authority shattered. Instead, Caesar chose the harder option. He resolved to force his way through the crisis, link up with his detached forces, and strike at the rebels where they felt safest. This was the pattern that made him formidable. When danger tightened around him, his response grew sharper, faster, and more decisive. Whatever hesitation had appeared during the assault, it vanished in the face of strategic disaster. He drove toward the Loire and searched for a crossing he could seize. One ford lay on the direct line of march and had likely been used for generations. It was not ideal, but it was available. Caesar attacked the enemy holding it, cleared the approaches, and pushed his army across in water that reached up to the soldiers' armpits. Cavalry were placed upstream at an angle to break the current and reduce the force of the flow against the infantry. Once across, the army found food and livestock. The harvest season was near, and the land could still feed a moving force. The troops rested, recovered, and then began a rapid march toward the territory where Caesar intended to reunite with his other command and restore control over the unravelling war, while the year was still young and the campaign season far from over. While Caesar was struggling around Gergovia, another Roman force was operating far to the north. Labienus, trusted with 4 legions, moved against the territory of the Parisii and advanced toward Lutetia. His baggage and food stores were left behind under guard at a secure rear base, stocked with new recruits recently arrived from Italy. From there, Labienus marched along the river routes, keeping to the left bank as his column followed the waterways that led toward the Seine. The moment his presence became known, neighbouring peoples began assembling to block his advance. Lutetia itself sat on an island in the Seine, roughly where the heart of modern Paris stands today. The Gallic command in the region was handed to Camulogenus, an older man but an experienced and respected soldier. Camulogenus read the Roman approach quickly. Seeing Labienus committed to the left bank, he positioned his army near marshland that could choke movement and deny the Romans a clean passage. The ground around the river junction created a natural obstacle, and it forced Labienus to stop short. The Romans attempted a direct solution first. They tried to build a passable route across the marsh by laying down branches and woven hurdles to make a firm surface. The work did not succeed. The wetlands swallowed the effort, and the Roman advance remained pinned. With the straightforward option failing, Labienus shifted to deception. Under cover of darkness, he pulled his troops back along the same bank he had used to approach, retreating just enough to make the enemy think the pressure had eased. The movement was not a withdrawal meant to concede ground, but a setup for a lateral strike. The column marched to another river town downstream, one that also occupied an island position. There, Labienus seized boats, crossed to the island, took control of the settlement, and quickly repaired the bridge that connected to the opposite bank. At dawn, the Roman army was moving again, now on the other side of the river system and advancing toward Lutetia from a direction Camulogenus had not immediately anticipated. The maneuver worked, but only briefly. Camulogenus realized what had happened and reacted fast. Rather than allowing the city to become a Roman foothold, he ordered Lutetia burned and the bridges destroyed. 2 armies now faced each other across the Seine, encamped on opposite banks, with the ruined city between them, the river serving as both barrier and battlefield line. Then the wider war intruded. News reached Labienus that Caesar had suffered a serious reverse at Gergovia. Around the Roman camps, the story was enlarged and sharpened, as rumours often are. Some claimed Caesar was already being forced back toward the Roman province by lack of food. At the same time, nearby tribes began to stir. The Bellovaci gathered forces, sensing that the moment had come to strike. Labienus suddenly found himself boxed in. On one side, a hostile people stood separated only by a river. On the other side lay the Seine, the Parisii, and Camulogenus. Worse still, Labienus was cut off from his supply base to the rear, and from the route he had used to advance. Under such conditions, reducing Lutetia no longer made sense. The priority shifted from conquest to survival. A single commander in enemy country could not crush a spreading revolt alone. The best outcome was to preserve the legions and rejoin Caesar as quickly as possible. To do that, Labienus needed to recross the Seine. But crossing under the eyes of an enemy army is one of the most dangerous movements an ancient army can attempt. A slow retreat would invite pursuit and encourage bolder attacks. A predictable return to the earlier crossing point would allow Camulogenus to block him there, and gathering boats again for a long move upriver would take time he did not have. Labienus chose a harder, but safer path to escape by audacity and misdirection, rather than by cautious withdrawal. He gathered his officers and set out a plan built on silence, speed, and confusion. Boats taken earlier were placed under reliable Roman cavalrymen and sent downstream quietly during the early hours of the night. A small force was left in the main camp to maintain the illusion that the Romans were still holding position. Another detachment was sent upriver with boats, moving loudly and openly, creating the impression that Labienus intended to march that way. Meanwhile, Labienus led the bulk of his army downriver to the hidden boats. A storm broke over the river, masking sound and limiting visibility. Under that cover, the main force crossed without being detected. Gallic outposts, sheltering from the weather, were scattered quickly when the Romans arrived. When dawn came, the enemy realized something was wrong, but not exactly what. Reports came in of Roman movements in several directions. From this, the Gauls drew a conclusion that seemed reasonable. Labienus must be trying to escape in separated groups, sacrificing some units so that others might survive. Determined to destroy the Romans completely, they split their army into 3 parts to hunt down each supposed detachment. Camulogenus personally took command of the group moving downriver, aiming to strike what he believed was one of the Roman fragments. Instead, he met the Roman main body drawn up and ready. At first light, the legions already across formed their line and attacked. The Gauls fought hard, and for a moment the battle turned into a test of discipline against fury. One Roman legion broke the enemy opposite it quickly. Another legion, facing the core of Camulogenus's men, found the fight far more difficult. Under the direct pressure of their commander, the Gauls held their ground stubbornly. Only when the Roman right shifted and struck into the flank and rear did the Gallic line finally crack. Cavalry then swept through the collapse, turning retreat into slaughter. Even so, many Gallic warriors stood their ground until they were cut down. The Gallic force still in the original camp heard the fighting and moved toward the Sound, taking position on higher ground in an attempt to stabilize the situation. It was too late. The Roman cavalry pressed them hard, cutting down those who could not escape into the woods. Camulogenus was killed, and the remaining Gallic detachments broke apart under pursuit. Labienus then gathered his scattered Roman units, marched back to the supply base where his baggage had been left, and from there moved to rejoin Caesar. The episode revealed Labienus at his strongest, calm under pressure, imaginative in movement, and ruthless in execution. His handling of boats, feints, night marches, and timing showed the level of skill Rome could produce in its senior commanders. In later years, his choices would be judged harshly, but in this phase of the war, his work served Caesar well and kept a dangerous northern front from collapsing into disaster. Meanwhile, Caesar's defeat at Gergovia sent shockwaves through Gaul. The Aedui revolt turned a serious setback into a crisis because this people carried weight far beyond their own territory. Their leaders escalated quickly, murdering hostages held in their custody and threatening further killings to intimidate any tribes that hesitated. A general council was called at Bibracte, and most of Gaul attended. Only a few people stayed out. The Aedui demanded the highest authority, but the assembled tribes chose Vercingetorix. The Aedui then supported him, but without full confidence or unity. Vercingetorix moved to turn political leadership into military power. Hostages were demanded from allies as insurance against wavering. A massive cavalry levy was ordered, and this mounted force became both a striking arm and a personal guard. Infantry numbers were already abundant. For the moment, nearly all of Gaul stood in arms, a rare peak of unity in a land usually divided by rivalries. Vercingetorix returned to the method that had hurt the Romans most, denying supplies. He urged allies to burn crops and homes again to starve the invaders and strip the land of everything an army needed to survive. He also pushed war outward. One allied army was sent toward the Alpine approaches to threaten Rome's friends and disrupt the edges of the Roman sphere. Other tribal forces were unleashed against regions nearer the province, meant to devastate and test the loyalty of communities that lived under Roman influence. Promises and flattery were used to tempt additional peoples into changing sides. The goal was not just battlefield victory, but the widening of revolt until Roman control cracked. The Roman defences in the province were thin. A limited force was thrown forward under a Roman commander, and some communities were beaten back behind their walls, with the loss of leading men. Other groups managed to hold their river boundary with scattered posts and constant watchfulness. But the situation was dangerous enough to force Caesar into immediate practical decisions. The enemy's cavalry had grown so large that Roman infantry alone could not secure marches and supply routes. Caesar sent across the Rhine to recruit additional mounted troops from German peoples already under Roman influence. He managed to raise a small but highly effective force and paired it with light infantry. To strengthen this new cavalry, he made a hard choice. Roman officers and elite volunteers were ordered to give up their horses so the Germans could ride better mounts. It was a measure that would sting Roman pride, but the war demanded efficiency, not comfort. After crossing the Loire and turning north, Caesar aimed to link up with Labienus. The two commanders met not far from the rear supply base. The attempt to keep the Roman forces divided had failed. Now Caesar held the largest concentration of Roman power seen in the war so far, with many legions gathered together, reinforced whenever losses and campaigning reduced their numbers. Alongside them marched allied light troops and cavalry, including the newly recruited Germans. The total strength was immense by ancient standards, large enough to stabilize a collapsing situation if handled correctly. With the armies united, Caesar's immediate problem was movement. A direct march south toward the province was blocked by rebel territory. Instead, he chose an eastern route, through lands that were still safer, planning to angle down toward a major Roman storehouse, and then reach the province from a direction less exposed to ambush. The objective was not only to defend Roman borders, it was also to rebuild the war from a secure foundation. If the uprising became total, the province would be the one place that could reliably feed, replace, and protect the Roman army while it prepared the next phase of conquest. Vercingetorix understood this and moved to stop it. After concentrating a large army near Bibracte, he advanced onto the likely Roman route and placed his forces to block the passage. He spread his army across key heights and road forks, positioned so that whichever path Caesar chose, Gallic troops would be waiting. Caesar marched toward the danger without knowing it was so close. The Gallic position was strong, anchored by high ground and supported by streams and broken terrain. Vercingetorix called his leaders together and framed the moment as decisive. Roman power, he argued, was vulnerable now, pulling back towards safety. If struck hard on the march, the Roman army could be shattered before it reached its base. He focused especially on cavalry, demanding aggressive action and binding his riders by oath to charge through the Roman formation, not merely attack at the edges. As Caesar continued his march up the valley, Vercingetorix shifted his infantry into position and sent his cavalry forward. The mounted force was divided into three groups. One meant to hit the Roman head of column, the others to strike both flanks. When Caesar reached open ground, he suddenly saw the enemy cavalry forming ahead. Then the other bodies appeared on either side. The attack had come as a surprise. Caesar reacted immediately and with control. He ordered his own cavalry out in three bodies to meet each threat. He halted the column, brought the baggage into a protected position, and drew up the legions in a compact battle formation, designed to resist attacks from multiple directions. Whenever Roman cavalry began to give ground, Infantry moved forward in support, threatening the enemy horse with disciplined lines and forcing them to pull back. The battle remained primarily a cavalry fight, but Roman infantry presence kept it from becoming a collapse at the edges. After extended skirmishing, the German cavalry on the Roman right gained a key hill, drove Gallic horsemen from it, and pursued them hard enough to shake the entire enemy formation. That pressure rippled outward. Gallic riders found themselves threatened from behind and at the side, and the three attacking bodies began to unravel. The retreat turned into flight. Roman cavalry cut down many and captured important prisoners, including notable leaders from the Aedui. The defeat damaged Vercingetorix's momentum. He withdrew with his infantry and baggage toward Alesia, a strong position that offered walls and high ground. Caesar pressed the advantage, securing his own baggage on a nearby height and harassing the retreat. The Gallic rearguard suffered heavy losses. Vercingetorix avoided returning to his previous camps, knowing that doing so might allow Caesar to cut him off from Alesia. He chose to sacrifice speed and order to reach the fortress. His baggage moved by a parallel route, and Caesar did not pursue it aggressively, focusing instead on the enemy army itself. The decision to offer open battle had been a serious mistake for Vercingetorix. His earlier method, the slow choking of Roman supplies through raids and burning, had forced Caesar into constant strain. But in open terrain, against trained legions and with Caesar present, the Romans could turn a cavalry fight into a controlled victory, especially with German riders acting as a sharp spearhead. For Caesar, the encounter was a turning point in attitude. He had been trying to break through towards safety and rebuild from the province. Now, the road south was no longer blocked. Vercingetorix's retreat removed the barrier that had been placed across the Roman route. At that moment, Caesar made a decisive shift. Instead of continuing the march toward his base, he turned directly against Vercingetorix's army. The situation had changed. The enemy had pulled back into a fortress, and Caesar no longer needed to fight his way through a wall of troops to reach safety. He could move from caution into pursuit, from survival into pressure. In the space of a single cavalry battle, the war's direction tilted. The next phase would not be a retreat towards security, but a deliberate advance toward the enemy's centre of gravity. 2 days after the fight along the Vanjan, Caesar's army reached Alesia and chose to surround it rather than rush it. What followed became one of the defining sieges of the ancient world. Not because the place was mythical or unreachable, but because the response was so methodical and so ambitious that it reshaped what a field army could build under pressure. Alesia stood on a high, isolated plateau. From a distance it looked like a hill, but up close it was an oval table of land, long from east to west and narrower from north to south, lifted roughly 500 feet above the valleys around it. 2 streams ran at its base, one to the north and one to the south, shaping the approaches and cutting the ground into channels. To the west stretched a broad open plain several miles long, wide enough for cavalry and visible from the heights. On the other 3 sides, at about a mile's distance from the edge of the plateau, a ring of hills rose to nearly the same height as Alesia itself, with gentle valleys flowing between them. The plateau had springs and wells, and paths led down toward the watercourses. The slope up to the top was not especially difficult, but the edge of the plateau was protected by stretches of rocky face. Writers often describe Alesia as if it were a natural fortress beyond human reach. The ground, however, was not magical. The slopes may be softer today after centuries of farming, but the shape of the land is still the shape of the land, and the Roman earthworks later found around the site prove that the terrain has not changed in any dramatic way. Alesia was strong in the context of ancient warfare, but it was not an untouchable mountain. In fact, there was at least one approach, especially from the southeast, where the land formed a kind of natural ramp that could support an aggressive push. The true danger for Caesar was not only the fortress itself, the larger risk was time. He knew that if he settled into a siege, the rest of Gaul would try to gather and send a relief army before the place could be reduced by slow pressure. The Romans approached from the east. Below the walls, Gallic forces had already built an outer camp with a ditch and a stone barrier. That forward position was also the most vulnerable, and it was where the defenders expected a decisive clash. Their line was extended downhill toward the streams to protect access to water, and the ends were shaped in a way that discouraged an attack from behind. Caesar examined the ground and decided that a full assault was too risky, especially after the failure at Gergovia. Alesia would be taken by containment, not by gambling everything on a rush at the walls. This decision led to an unusual arithmetic of war. Caesar had roughly 11 legions, around 50,000 heavy infantry, with cavalry and allied foot soldiers adding more. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix had a massive force, and even if the reported numbers were exaggerated, the basic reality remained. Caesar was trying to trap a very large army with a smaller one, while fully expecting another huge army to appear from outside. In most periods, commanders preferred to have overwhelming superiority before attempting a complete investment. Caesar did not have that luxury. That is part of what made the siege so extreme. Another failure here would not simply be embarrassing. It could unravel the entire campaign. The first move was to seize the surrounding high ground. Roman detachments took control of the hills to the north, east, and south, and the army began mapping the ring that would cut Alesia off from the world. Cavalry was placed near the watercourses where movement was easier. Infantry took the hilltops. Then the digging began. A continuous line of fortifications was laid out from ridge to ridge, following the slopes and shaping itself to the landscape. The ring was long, and it needed strong points. Small fortified posts were built at intervals, solid enough to resist sudden attacks and to anchor the long stretches between them. These posts were lightly held during the day and reinforced at night, keeping the perimeter alive at all hours. Several main camps were established where the ground dictated good positions, with their exits facing toward Alesia. Some camps were larger, some smaller, but each one was designed to command the approaches in front of it and to strengthen its weak sides with extra earthwork. Cavalry camps were placed on the plain and near the rivers, not as deep as the infantry camps, but positioned for rapid response. Scattered along the line were dozens of smaller strong points. Some were substantial enough to leave traces that could be found later. Others were more like compact shelters and platforms that vanished with time. The landscape itself suggests where many of them must have stood, because the hills and valleys force a limited number of sensible defensive placements. The siege lines were barely underway when Vercingetorix tested the Romans with cavalry. He brought mounted troops out into the open western plain and forced a hard fight. At first, the Roman horse struggled. Caesar responded by drawing infantry into line in front of the camps, both to prevent a sudden breakout from the town and to steady the cavalry by showing the solid wall of the legions behind them. That visual support mattered. The German riders attached to Caesar's force charged again with renewed confidence, hit the Gallic cavalry with greater weight, and finally drove them back. The pursuit carried right up to the gates of the outer Gallic position. Caesar moved infantry forward at the right moment, and the combined pressure turned retreat into disorder. Many Gauls tried to scramble across ditch and barrier, and many failed. After inflicting serious losses, the Roman allied cavalry withdrew to safety. It is striking how often the war in Gaul came down to mounted clashes and skirmishing, rather than set-piece infantry battles. Now, the logic of the siege became unavoidable. Vercingetorix still hesitated to try a breakout while there was time. He feared meeting the legions on open ground, and he clung to the hope that this siege might end as Gergovia had. Instead, he made a different move. During the night, before the Roman ring was fully sealed, he sent his cavalry out through the valleys. The reason was practical as well as strategic. Feeding horses inside the fortress would have been impossible, and those riders were needed to ride across Gaul, spread the alarm, and force the tribes into action. They carried a message that was blunt and urgent. The defenders had food for roughly 30 days if managed carefully, and relief had to arrive before that limit ran out. If the fortress fell, the wider cause would fall with it. Inside Alesia, the defenders withdrew fully onto the plateau. Rations were controlled centrally. Livestock could be divided quickly, but grain was saved and issued more carefully. Whether every man truly fit within the cramped limits of the plateau remains debated, but ancient armies could compress themselves into tight spaces, and necessity forces habits that comfort never would. The walls of the stronghold sat at the edge of the rocky drop, overlooking slopes that rose from the valleys. Some parts of the edge and the slopes were covered with brush or woodland, making the perimeter uneven and difficult to assault. Except by the eastern approach, hunger would be the main force that could push the defenders out. They had water. What they lacked was time. For Caesar, the siege became a race between engineering and the arrival of the relief army. He worked with relentless precision. The soil in places was rough and stony, more difficult than open farmland. The surrounding terrain was harsher than it appears today. At the same time, the defenders launched frequent raids to harass workers and disrupt construction. Light troops had to guard the labourers constantly. This was not passive digging. It was digging under threat. The Roman works were built in layers. In the most dangerous sector, a massive trench was dug first, deep and wide, with steep sides placed well in front of the main defences. Its purpose was to prevent sudden rushes while the main line took shape, and to keep attackers far enough away that missiles thrown from the town could not easily reach the core construction. Behind that came additional ditches. One section was designed so it could be filled with water from a nearby stream, turning the ground into a barrier that could not be crossed quickly. Another ditch ran alongside it, dry but equally imposing. Farther out, the earth thrown up from digging became a rampart and a wall high enough to force attackers to climb under fire. Towers were built at regular intervals along the line, creating overlapping fields of attack. On top, wooden barriers and sharpened stakes were arranged so that climbing would be slowed and men would be exposed longer. Over a front that stretched for miles, the scale of this was enormous. The same men who fought with sword and javelin now moved earth and timber as if they were born to it. The strain on the army was constant. Men had to build and also forage for food. A long defensive ring consumes manpower, and the longer the ring, the thinner the defenders. Caesar needed the fortifications to be so strong that fewer men could hold them, freeing troops for emergencies and preventing the army from being trapped by the force that was certain to come. So he added a final layer of obstacles, designed not to look impressive but to wound, confuse, and break the rhythm of any assault. Rows of shallow trenches were dug in front, set close together with sharpened branches sunk into them and interwoven so that movement through them became slow and painful. Beyond that were lines of concealed pits arranged in a staggered pattern, each one hiding a hardened stake at the bottom and covered so that men would fall without warning. In front of those were heavy stakes driven into the ground, some fitted with iron points or hooks, forming a field that punished anyone trying to charge. These were not decorative defences. They were practical machines built to turn darkness and panic against the attacker. But Caesar's plan did not stop with sealing Alesia in. A second ring of fortifications was begun facing outward. It was designed to withstand the relief army that everyone knew was coming. The outer line followed the same logic. It ran where the ground allowed, paused where cliffs made works unnecessary, then resumed across plateaus and slopes. The lengths recorded in Caesar's own account would later match the lines traced in the earth. Whatever debate exists about ancient narratives in general, the physical remains at Alesia show that this was not exaggeration. It was real labour, real distance, real engineering carried out under wartime pressure. In about 40 days, the double ring was largely complete. The army then stocked food to reduce the danger of constant foraging and to prepare for the moment when the besiegers themselves might become besieged. Everything was now set for the next phase. Endurance against time and numbers. The cavalry that escaped from Alesia did its work. Across Gaul, leaders gathered, argued and committed forces. A massive levy was ordered, large enough to feel unstoppable in a world where strength was often measured by sheer headcount. Even peoples who had benefited from Roman favour swung toward the national cause. Command was assigned to several prominent leaders, and a council representing many tribes supported them. The relief army assembled and marched toward Alesia, convinced that the Romans could not withstand so vast a host, especially with attacks coming both from outside and from within the fortress. Inside Alesia, the weeks had already taken their toll. The initial food estimate was proving too optimistic. Starvation loomed. Desperate ideas surfaced, including brutal proposals for survival. But the defenders eventually chose another option: to push the non-combatant population out of the stronghold. The people were driven toward the Roman lines in hopes that the besiegers would take them in, even as captives. Caesar refused. The Romans would not accept them, and the displaced were forced back toward the walls, trapped between both armies, suffering in the open. When the relief army finally arrived, it camped on heights to the southwest, within close range of the Roman lines. The very next day, its cavalry poured into the great western plain, with infantry posted on the slopes behind to support them. From Alesia's plateau, the entire movement could be seen. In response, Vercingetorix brought his own troops outside the walls, ready to strike in coordination. The defenders had prepared bundles of brush and hurdles meant to fill ditches and smother the obstacles. The first serious attempt began with forward movement toward the trenches, and for a moment it looked as though the fight might become a full infantry engagement. Caesar answered by throwing in his allied cavalry, including Germans, and the relief army responded with cavalry, reinforced by light troops, who could throw missiles and help stabilize the line. The fighting intensified, filled with shouting from below and answering cries from the plateau above. It lasted for hours, from midday into evening. Yet even with all the noise and motion, the main infantry bodies did not fully commit. It remained largely a cavalry struggle supported by archers and slingers. Late in the day, when Caesar's cavalry was close to breaking, the German riders regrouped and charged again with concentrated force. They drove the relief cavalry back and pursued hard, cutting down the supporting missile troops who could not escape as quickly. The defenders in Alesia pulled back in frustration. There had been no true breach of the Roman lines. The first effort had failed. A second assault came 2 nights later, this time planned for darkness. The relief army had prepared more hurdles, brought ladders and hooks, and chose midnight to strike the western sector suddenly. The roar of the attack woke the plateau. Vercingetorix ordered his own men out at once to support the effort from inside. In the dark, The Gauls worked to fill pits and trenches while covering their movement with arrows and slingstones. The Romans were ready. Reinforcements were pulled from safer points and rushed to the threatened area. Roman commanders moved troops where the pressure was hottest. Missiles answered missiles. Stones were hurled down, arrows shot back, and the defenders used heavy spear-like projectiles from the ramparts at close range with brutal effect. Night fighting distorted everything. Shields meant less, when visibility was low, and the confusion of obstacles was often deadlier than the enemy's weapons. As attackers pressed closer, more of them fell into concealed pits and tangled fields, and the momentum of the assault began to break. The same darkness that protected them also betrayed them, turning coordination into chaos. By dawn, fatigue and casualties were mounting. Fear spread that Roman forces on the southern hills might strike an exposed flank. The relief army began to withdraw. Inside, the defenders also found the obstacles crushingly slow. Much of the night had been spent trying to cross the massive forward trench, and progress beyond it had been limited. When daylight made the failure obvious, Vercingetorix ordered the retreat as well. The second attempt, louder and better prepared than the first, had still failed to crack the ring. The siege tightened, and time continued to drain away on the plateau above. After 2 failed attacks on the siege lines at Alesia, the Gallic coalition began to feel the pressure in a new way. These were not full-scale assaults in the sense of committing every man, yet they had cost lives and confidence. The commanders on the outside understood that morale could not absorb repeated disappointment forever. If the next attempt failed, the relief army might start to fracture, and the men might drift from determination into resignation. So the leaders agreed on one last, decisive effort, and they approached it like a problem to be solved, rather than a charge to be repeated. Commius argued that the only path left was to crack a weak point in the Roman defences. Scouts and messengers were sent out to study the perimeter. Country people were questioned about where the works were strongest, where they were thinner, which units held which sections, and what kinds of obstacles had been built at each stretch. The coalition needed a place where numbers could matter and where the Roman system could be overwhelmed before reserves arrived. One area stood out. On the northwest side of Alesia rose a hill too broad to be neatly wrapped into the outer line of fortifications. The Romans had been forced to run their defences lower, at the foot of the slope, on less commanding ground. 2 legions held this sector, camped on the steep hillside under the command of 2 senior officers. For the Gallic leadership, this looked like the hinge of the whole ring. If a breach could be opened there, the siege would collapse in moments. A force of 60,000 was selected for the main blow. These men were drawn from tribes with the strongest reputations for fighting, and they were placed under a single commander, Vercingetorix. The movement was carried out at night. The column took a long, looping route to avoid detection and arrived near the chosen hill before daylight, concealed on the far slope where Roman patrols could not easily see them. They rested there, fed, ready, waiting for the signal. At noon, the attack began. Vercingetorix formed his men and drove them forward with speed, pushing aside any small outposts that covered the approaches. They came down onto the northwest camp with the weight of a coordinated assault, not a skirmish. At the same time, another part of the plan unfolded on the western plain. Gallic cavalry surged forward in a loud, aggressive demonstration, with infantry stepping up behind them, creating the appearance of a broad attack along the most visible front. This was meant to fix Roman attention and make it harder for Caesar to guess where the true danger lay. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix saw what was happening almost immediately. He had been watching for the relief army's next move day after day. and he understood that this was the moment he had been waiting for. The gates opened and his forces poured out, with equipment prepared in advance for a storming attempt. Ladders, hooks, and protective covers for men working close to the walls. The attack from within struck opposite the main effort outside, slightly offset so that pressure would fall on the same general sector from both directions. In effect, Caesar now faced a crisis that every besieger fears: simultaneous assaults from outside and inside, aimed at the same vulnerable line. For Caesar, the difficulty was not only the violence of the assault, but the uncertainty of the whole field. His troops were spread around a very long perimeter. No one could be sure that the northwest strike was the only one, or that another mass would not appear elsewhere. With such huge Gallic numbers present, it would have been reasonable to expect multiple heavy attacks. The Roman line was strong, but strength on paper becomes fragile when defenders are thin and must respond to threats in several places at once. The fight hit like a storm. The Gauls pressed against every section that looked weaker, probing for gaps and climbing points, throwing missiles, filling ditches, forcing the defenders to spend their strength and their ammunition. They fought with the intensity of men who believed they were at the edge of national survival. The Romans, equally aware of what failure would mean, fought with the grim focus of soldiers who understood there was no safe retreat behind them. Caesar managed the crisis from elevated observation points that allowed him to see different parts of the ring. From one of these vantage places, he directed reinforcements, sending cohorts toward the hardest pressure and warning other sectors to hold. The battle became a test of movement and timing as much as courage. Units were shifted from quieter stretches of the line, and messengers ran constantly. The aim was to keep any one point from collapsing before help arrived. The northwest sector carried the heaviest burden. There, the attackers held higher ground and could throw missiles down with greater effect. The best fighters had been concentrated there, and the relief army could rotate men in and out, keeping fresh bodies in the front line. They built up the assault methodically, pushing earth and material toward the walls, raising the ground to reach the Roman height, and using protective formations to approach under fire. Over time, the defenders began to run short of missiles. The fight had lasted for hours. The pressure did not ease. Seeing the danger, Caesar ordered Labienus to bring several cohorts from another camp to the northwest, and to be prepared, if necessary, to break out with a sword attack rather than remain pinned to the wall. Caesar then moved toward the western plain to steady the troops there, because the cavalry demonstration was still loud and distracting, and it was important that no part of the Roman line began to panic. While attention was being pulled northwest, the defenders inside Alesia shifted their effort. Their first push had stalled, so they struck again at a different spot where the defences were steeper but less heavily guarded. Under a heavy storm of missiles and with tools used at close range, they managed to drive defenders back from a section of the works, rip down protective coverings, and begin filling ditches. This was exactly the kind of sudden local success that could trigger collapse if it spread. Caesar responded with rapid reinforcement. Brutus was sent with several cohorts to the threatened point. When that did not stabilize the line, Fabius followed with more. Even that was not enough at first. Caesar then moved there personally to restore the defense. At close range, leadership mattered. The presence of the commander could steady frightened men, force order back into confusion, and turn a retreat into a stand. After hard fighting, the attack from within was finally checked and driven off, but the wider danger remained because the northwest struggle was still reaching a breaking point. At the northwest camp, Labienus could not fully stop the pressure. Caesar made a decisive choice. cavalry was sent out beyond the fortifications on a wide circuit, ordered to emerge from the northern ravines and climb along the hills so it could strike the Gallic assault force from behind. This was not a simple charge across open ground. It was an attempt to appear where the enemy did not expect a threat, to create shock and confusion in the packed mass pressing the walls. As soon as the internal assault had been pushed back, Caesar gathered a small striking group of cohorts and mounted troops and hurried toward the northwest to support Labienus. By that time, Labienus had already pulled additional units from strong points that could spare them. The defence had become a patchwork of borrowed strength, a line held together by constant movement and the ability to judge where the collapse would happen first. The Gallic reserves, for reasons that are still debated, did not all surge forward at the same moment. That hesitation mattered. If the entire mass had pressed at once while the Romans were stretched thin, the line might have broken. Instead, the fight remained violent but uneven, with intense pressure at the main point and large bodies still waiting behind. When Caesar arrived at the northwest sector, the troops could see him clearly. He wore the commander's cloak over his armour, a signal that the man giving orders was also willing to share the danger at the point of greatest risk. That sight lifted the defenders. Under his eye, men who were exhausted and nearly out of missiles shifted to close combat with renewed aggression. The defenders began to push forward rather than merely hold. The cavalry sent on the long circuit now appeared behind the attackers. German horsemen led the strike, and the sudden impact into the rear of the Gallic mass changed everything. A loud shout rolled across the line, and the Roman infantry surged at the same moment. The attackers, pressed from the front and hit from behind, lost cohesion. Once the mass broke, it became a flight rather than an organised withdrawal. Cavalry cut down men as they ran. Leaders fell. Some were killed where they stood. Others were captured and standards were taken in quantity. Inside Alesia, the defenders saw the outside force collapsing and understood what it meant. The relief army was no longer forcing the siege open. Caesar could now turn his full attention back toward the plateau. Vercingetorix's men withdrew rapidly and retreated into the fortress in despair. Outside, the panic spread even to those who had not fought. Retreat became rout. Men scattered into woods and valleys, seeking any path home. If the Roman cavalry had been fresh and numerous enough, the slaughter might have been far worse. Even so, many were killed, and the coalition army dissolved. With the relief effort shattered, the situation inside Alesia became hopeless. The leadership in the fortress could no longer pretend that rescue would arrive. The fighting had been their final throw, and it had failed. Vercingetorix offered himself up to his own people as the price of ending the catastrophe. Envoys went to Caesar. The terms were not negotiable. Weapons were surrendered, leaders were demanded. Ancient sources later described a dramatic scene. Vercingetorix emerged, wearing his finest armour, rode out on horseback, circled Caesar where he sat, then dismounted, removed his arms, and remained silent at Caesar's feet until he was led away. Whatever the exact choreography, the meaning was clear. The war's central figure had accepted defeat publicly, turning the end of the siege into a political ritual as much as a military outcome. Afterward, the Romans separated prisoners by usefulness. Certain captives from major tribes were held back as leverage, intended to help stabilize regions that had been wavering. Most others were distributed as battlefield spoils, a standard practice of Roman war that ensured the army felt materially rewarded for long hardship. Traders followed armies for exactly this reason. After a victory, they arrived quickly, buying captives and goods at low prices, turning the aftermath of war into commerce. Alesia was remembered because it displayed several forms of Roman power at once. The engineering was extraordinary, the discipline held under pressure, and the ability to move reserves along a long perimeter decided the day. At the same time, it exposed a weakness in the Gallic coalition. Numbers alone could not replace coordination, and divided action wasted strength. Once the siege ended, Gaul never again rose in a single national wave. Resistance continued in pockets, but the moment of unified revolt had passed. Caesar moved back toward Allied territory and restored control without much difficulty. Major tribes that had supported the rebellion hurried to submit and provide hostages. Many prisoners were released to rebuild relationships where useful, a calculated blend of severity and reconciliation. With the campaigning season closing, the army was then spread out into winter quarters across multiple regions, each detachment placed to discourage fresh uprisings and to secure supply routes. Caesar fixed his headquarters at Bibracte, while senior commanders took legions to key tribal territories and river lines where grain and movement could be controlled. Even after such a decisive year, the end was not immediate peace. The Gallic leaders had learned that a single grand uprising could be crushed, but they also understood that scattered, simultaneous resistance could stretch Roman control thin. That realization shaped what followed. Instead of one giant war effort, smaller revolts began to form in different places, aimed at forcing Caesar to chase fires across a wide landscape. Caesar reacted quickly, launching winter operations, striking before alliances could fully harden, and using speed as a weapon. In early moves, forces were concentrated against the Bituriges. The aim was not only to win a fight, but to prevent a region from becoming the centre of a broader coalition. The approach was rapid and controlled. Prisoners were taken, but wide destruction was avoided, partly to preserve supplies and partly to prevent panic from spreading into neighbouring territories. Shortly after, pressure shifted toward the Carnutes, around Genabum. There, the fighting was less about pitched battles and more about pursuing scattered groups, using cavalry and allied troops to disrupt any attempt to gather strength. The next major concern rose in the north, where the Bellovaci and neighbouring peoples gathered in a strong position in difficult terrain. Marshes and forests protected their camp, and their leaders planned to fight only if they could isolate small Roman forces. Caesar tried to exploit that mindset by creating the appearance of a smaller army, adjusting the march order so the enemy would misread the number of legions present. He then established a fortified camp on high ground opposite their position, building defences strong enough to protect foragers and to bait the enemy into attacking prepared works rather than dragging the Romans into the marsh. Skirmishing followed, especially around crossings and foraging parties. The Bellovaci gained confidence after small successes and reinforcements from German riders. Caesar called up additional legions to ensure that the enemy position could be contained and pressured, rather than assaulted recklessly. When reinforcements arrived, the balance shifted. The Bellovaci attempted to withdraw by night, moving baggage and non-combatants first, and using a rearguard posture to hide the retreat. Caesar advanced carefully, wary of ambush, and the enemy escaped through a clever trick, setting fire to material to create smoke cover and confusion. The struggle continued as a war of traps and counter-traps. The Bellovaci relied on ambushes against Roman foragers, hoping to drain the invader through attrition. Caesar responded by accompanying foraging columns with heavier protection and choosing moments when the enemy would expose their best fighters. In one such encounter, an ambush was turned back on its makers. The attackers were trapped against a river line and destroyed, including their chief. That loss broke the remaining will to resist, and peace was sought. Some leaders escaped into German territory, but the region as a whole fell back under Roman control. By this stage, another problem was emerging, not only revolt, but movement. Some communities began to consider migration as a way to escape Roman domination. Caesar worked to prevent that by distributing his forces across multiple regions, keeping pressure everywhere and denying space for new concentrations. Some detachments were sent to troubled southern areas, others to guard provinces and mountain approaches. Caesar kept a core force under direct control for rapid reaction, and moved toward regions where dangerous leaders still had influence. The final parts of this period included harsh actions in certain territories, justified in Roman terms as denying refuge and support to persistent enemies. Even in ancient narratives, these measures stand out for their severity. They also show the darker side of a campaign that elsewhere balanced force with negotiated submission. From there, trusted commanders were dispatched again to overawe frontier tribes, keeping the wider map quiet while Caesar's control hardened into permanent rule. It is striking how rarely the Gallic war narrative names a specific legion. Most of the time, the units remain anonymous, and only later hints allow a careful reader to guess who was where. Even then, certainty is not always possible. Commanders rotated, detachments were reshuffled, and the story often treats the army as a single instrument rather than a set of clearly labelled parts. One formation does stand out more than the rest: the 10th. It appears again and again, not because the sources routinely list legion numbers, but because Caesar himself repeatedly singled it out as a trusted tool, often placing it where he intended to exert personal control. By the spring of 51 BCE, the great coalition that had once rallied around Alesia was broken. Yet the countryside was not fully calm. The remaining danger came less from grand tribal armies and more from drifting bands of armed men, runaway slaves, raiders, veterans of failed revolts, who moved through the provinces like sparks looking for dry ground. Two leaders, Draps and Lucterius, gathered such a force and headed south, aiming for safety or opportunity beyond the reach of Roman pressure. Their march drew Roman attention because small groups like this could reignite unrest if they reached sympathetic regions. At the same time, another crisis was unfolding in Western Gaul. A friendly allied leader, Dyrrachium, found himself trapped inside a city under siege by Dumnacus of the Andes. The Roman commander, Caninius, marched from winter quarters with 2 legions to break the siege, but the enemy presence was heavier than expected. Rather than gamble on a costly assault, he chose a strong position nearby and built a camp that could not be easily stormed. The attackers tried to take it anyway and were thrown back with losses. The siege force then learned that Roman reinforcements were approaching under Fabius, and that news alone changed everything. The besiegers lifted the blockade and withdrew beyond the Loire, trying to slip away before the situation turned into a trap. Fabius caught them on the move near a river crossing and punished the rear of the column hard, taking plunder and inflicting damage that carried a clear message. The next day, Roman cavalry pressed the pursuit too aggressively and stretched too far ahead of the infantry. The retreating enemy turned, reinforced their horse with foot soldiers, and suddenly the pursuers found themselves in a dangerous fight, worn out and close to being overwhelmed. The arrival of the legions reversed the danger. The enemy line broke, the retreat turned into a rout, and the fleeing force lost men in large numbers. Their baggage train was taken, stripping them not only of supplies, but of momentum and morale. The Andes region, deprived of its fighters and war material, fell quiet. That success cleared the way for a new assignment. A smaller but more unpredictable enemy body, about 5,000 men made up of raiders and desperate fugitives, was moving toward the province under Draps and Lucterius. They were not a national army, but they were mobile, violent, and willing to gamble on sudden attacks. Caninius was ordered to intercept them. Fabius went north to steady regions that had recently been restless, while the raiders, realizing they could not safely push into the province against disciplined legions, halted among the Cadorci and seized a fortress called Uxellodunum. Uxellodunum was chosen because it looked like the kind of place that could delay any pursuer. It stood high above the surrounding land on a rocky plateau with steep faces that discouraged assault. Access was difficult, and the defenders did not need elaborate walls to feel protected. Caninius pursued quickly, took the surrounding heights and began to build siege lines. Camps were positioned on nearby high ground so that Roman forces could watch approaches and block exits. One camp required heavier fortification because it lay near a route that could be used for sudden sorties. Others, protected by terrain, needed less work. The defenders understood what starvation had done at Alesia and decided they would not allow that pattern to repeat. Most of their men were sent out to gather grain and build a supply depot at a distance, while the garrison inside the fortress staged frequent attacks to create the illusion of greater numbers and to disrupt Roman construction. The plan depended on bringing food in gradually, at night, in small convoys along hidden paths. It failed because Roman outposts listened as carefully as they watched. One night, a supply train moved along a steep, wooded route, the sounds of animals and load gear carrying through the dark. Caninius struck quickly and captured the entire convoy. Lucterius, separated from the main body, could not reconnect with Draps. Draps, waiting at the supply point, did not yet understand the scale of the disaster and assumed the grain had reached the fortress. Caninius then shifted from blocking tactics to destruction. One legion remained behind to hold the camps and siege works. With the other legion and cavalry, he moved on the supply depot itself, seized the surrounding heights and closed the trap. The raiders had placed themselves in low ground, with hills dominating them. The Roman attack dismantled the entire foraging party. Draps was captured, the siege lines were completed, and soon Fabius arrived, bringing additional strength and allowing the encirclement to be held with confidence. The fortress was now isolated, and the raiders inside could no longer rely on outside movement. Caesar was not present at the opening of this operation. He had been moving through Gaul, tightening control, rewarding cooperation, and punishing open defiance where he judged it necessary. In one notable case, a figure blamed for recent rebellion among the Carnutes was executed after soldiers demanded an example. Actions like this were designed to prevent entire communities from believing rebellion carried no cost, while also avoiding collective punishment that might drive neutral groups into resistance. When reports from Caninius made clear that Uxellodunum had become a symbol as well as a problem, Caesar moved fast. He left a subordinate with 2 legions to follow by regular marches and rode ahead with cavalry. The logic was political as much as military. Local groups knew Caesar's term in Gaul was nearing its end. If a stubborn fortress could hold out, others might interpret it as proof that time was on the rebels' side. Caesar wanted the opposite lesson to spread. Resistance, even in the strongest terrain, would be crushed quickly and decisively. On arrival, Caesar assessed the situation and saw that food was not the decisive lever. The defenders had grain. Water was the weakness. A stream ran below the western cliffs, through a narrow ravine. It could not be diverted easily, and the terrain made a direct blockade difficult. Instead, Caesar turned the ravine into a killing zone. Archers, slingers, and siege engines were placed to cover the approach routes, so that collecting water became an act of calculated risk. Over time, repeated casualties forced the defenders to rely on a single safer point. That point was a spring rising between the fortress and the stream, close enough to the walls to be protected by defenders, yet exposed enough to be threatened by persistent pressure. Caesar pushed siege shelters forward and raised a mound toward the spring, a laborious job carried out under constant fighting. The defenders resisted with skirmishes and missile storms, and Roman casualties mounted. But the works continued to crawl forward. Caesar then added a second, quieter method: mining. A tunnel was driven through rock toward the source of the spring. The aim wasn't to break into the fortress, but to reach the water channel itself, tap it, and steal it. As the mound rose, a high tower was built on top, turning the area around the spring into a deadly funnel. Any defender approaching with a water vessel became a target from above. The tower could not batter the fortress walls from that distance, but it did not need to. Its job was to make the spring unusable. Thirst began to do what weapons could not. Animals died first. Then the strain spread through the garrison and civilians. Still, the defenders attempted one last violent escape from the trap. They gathered flammable materials and rolled burning barrels down onto the Roman works, trying to set the mound and shelters ablaze while launching a sortie to push defenders away from the fire. The moment was dangerous. Carefully built siege structures can be undone quickly by flame and panic. Caesar answered with misdirection. A coordinated show of pressure was ordered from multiple sides, creating the impression of a general assault on the fortress. The defenders, uncertain where the real breach might come, pulled back inside to guard the walls rather than stay outside fighting near the burning works. That hesitation gave Roman soldiers time to fight the fire, stabilize the line, and even push the siege position forward once the flames were controlled. Then the mine achieved its purpose. The tunnel reached the water source and diverted the flow. To those inside, the spring did not merely become dangerous, it began to vanish. They had assumed it could not be touched. When it failed, the effect was psychological as well as practical. The defenders interpreted it as something beyond ordinary human reach, and combined with thirst, it broke the last resolve. Uxellodunum surrendered. Caesar's response was harsh and calculated. The leaders had already been taken. For the fighters, a visible punishment was applied. Mutilation designed to warn future rebels that continued resistance would leave permanent marks, even if life was spared. One of the captured chiefs chose starvation over whatever he expected next. The event became a final, brutal punctuation mark at the end of the Gallic resistance. With major organised opposition extinguished, the rest of the year was spent in motion rather than battle. Gaul was not treated as a conquered battlefield anymore, but as a territory that needed to be held together politically. Caesar moved through regions accepting submissions, settling disputes, and stabilizing relationships. Legions were distributed across the map for winter so that no zone felt empty of Roman presence. Several were placed among the Belgae, others among the Aedui, others positioned near coastal peoples and near the old centres of revolt. The point was deterrence and response speed, not conquest. By this stage, only a few dangerous figures remained at large. Some drifted into raiding and exile, and later traditions claimed that at least one found refuge across the sea. For most communities, the question was no longer whether Rome could be expelled, but how to survive under Roman control without being crushed again. Caesar's policy in the final phase aimed at lowering the temperature. He reduced the causes that could trigger revolt, rewarded cooperative elites, and avoided introducing new burdens that might feel like fresh humiliation after years of war. The country had been drained by repeated defeats, and that exhaustion itself became a tool of control. Stability could be purchased by restraint because the alternative, another round of destruction, was something many communities could no longer afford. With spring opening, Caesar turned his attention back toward Italy. He travelled through towns, reaffirmed loyalties, then returned north for a grand review of the army. It was a deliberate display. Disciplined formations. Veteran units hardened by years of marching and engineering. Soldiers who could build siege works as readily as they could fight. After that, Caesar positioned himself near the political centre of gravity, moving to Ravenna as events in Italy began to matter as much as anything across the Alps. The campaigns in Gaul, taken as a whole, show a transformation that is easy to miss when only the great set pieces are remembered. Caesar did not begin as an unmatched commander. He learned through risk, error, adaptation, and relentless practice. The legions did the same. They entered the war as mixed-quality forces drawn from a society that often struggled to maintain discipline. They ended it as veteran formations whose confidence had been forged in marches, sieges, ambushes, and sudden reversals. Their most defining trait was not perfect order in camp life, but a kind of combat discipline, an ability to hold a line under pressure, recover from shocks, and strike at the decisive moment. Gaul, meanwhile, produced opponents who cannot be dismissed as merely brave. Several leaders showed real strategic insight and political talent. They were defeated not because courage was absent, but because unity and sustained coordination were difficult to maintain across many independent peoples. Roman organization, engineering, and leadership exploited every hesitation and every division. The result was not only a military conquest, but a political shift. After years of resistance, the country did not rise again on the same scale. Local conflicts continued and remote corners remained difficult to manage, but the era of mass national revolt ended. When Caesar received command in Gaul, his legal authority was narrow. His mandate allowed him to defend the exposed frontiers of the existing Roman province and little more. Previous governors had remained within these limits, and there was no formal expectation that the office would become a tool of expansion. By this period, certain principles resembling international norms had begun to exist, but they carried little weight when confronted by raw power. Rome rarely acknowledged meaningful rights among non-Roman peoples, and this was especially true of the Gauls, whose earlier invasions had once brought the Republic close to destruction. The political environment of Rome itself was unstable and competitive. Power was personal, ambition was unchecked, and few leading men acted for anything beyond their own advancement. Caesar emerged from this system fully shaped by it. His education and political upbringing had taught him to bend circumstance toward personal ambition, rather than submit to restraint. He did not act as an isolated individual, but as the representative of a powerful faction, and the success of that faction depended entirely on his own achievements. For him, war meant command. Command meant an army, and an army was the most direct instrument for acquiring influence at Rome. At the time he entered Gaul, Pompey still stood as the dominant figure within the ruling alliance. That balance was never going to last. Caesar quickly understood that lasting authority required exclusive control. Without major military success, he could gain neither reputation nor leverage, and without those, survival in Roman politics was uncertain. Conquest was not a diversion, but a necessity. To remove the Gallic threat permanently would elevate its conqueror above all rivals, since the Gauls had long been Rome's most feared enemy. The destruction of that danger promised unmatched prestige. Fortune favoured Caesar early. Almost immediately, the Helvetian migration erupted. creating a crisis that allowed him to act beyond his original brief. Each subsequent development followed naturally. After the Helvetii were defeated, allied tribes appealed for protection against German forces. Caesar could plausibly claim that he was defending Roman allies and provincial security. This justification fit Roman tradition well. Rome had always aided its allies when advantage followed. Caesar followed the same logic, and Gaul expressed gratitude for liberation without anticipating subjugation. The campaign against the northern tribes required more careful explanation. Expanding operations into Belgic territory stretched legal arguments thin, but Caesar framed the move as preventive defense. Any large tribal concentration, even if not overtly hostile, could threaten the province. This reasoning later carried him across the Rhine and into Britain. The moral justification is debatable, yet the pattern is familiar even in later centuries. The essential point is consistency. Caesar maintained a coherent rationale for expansion and articulated it convincingly. Publicly, he made legality appear to follow success. Privately, every victory hardened an army loyal to him alone, giving him the power to dominate Roman politics. This approach does not separate Caesar from his contemporaries. Roman public virtue had long since eroded. Advancement demanded self-interest, and restraint was often fatal. Caesar cannot be praised as a model of civic idealism, nor fairly condemned for ambition alone. Rome itself required a figure capable of imposing order on its trajectory. In that sense, Caesar fulfilled a historical role, much as later ages would rely on similarly driven individuals. His contribution lay not in moral purity, but in effectiveness. As a military leader, criticism narrows sharply. Strategic judgment, operational clarity, and relentless energy define his conduct. Errors occurred, but they served as lessons rather than liabilities. Generosity appeared at times, but so did cruelty, often excessive and unnecessary. Though certain customs resembling laws of war existed, Caesar ignored them whenever they conflicted with his aims. Politically, this weakens his image. Militarily, it clarifies his intent. In Gaul, Caesar's policy balanced conciliation and destruction. Some tribes were rewarded, others crushed. Supplies were secured even as enemy resources were denied. Social divisions were exploited deliberately. With millions of inhabitants opposing a relatively small professional force, no other method was available. From a strategic perspective, this approach was unavoidable, and within that context it was executed skillfully. The geographical structure of Gaul favoured a commander who understood central positioning. The Roman province formed a forward projection into hostile territory. Allied peoples lived along its flanks, while unstable groups threatened from the east. Caesar recognized the advantage immediately. His early campaign secured the eastern flank, making further advance safe. Natural barriers such as rivers and mountain ranges reduced exposure, provided neighbouring tribes were friendly. Caesar invested heavily in ensuring that they were. From these secured positions, he advanced northward along major river corridors, using them as protected lines of movement. Once established, this central axis allowed safe operations outward in multiple directions. Fortified camps reinforced alliances and anchored movement. Control of key river crossings and valleys ensured logistical security. When Belgic territory fell, western and coastal operations became possible. Southern campaigns followed naturally. This was central manoeuvre in its purest form. The most dangerous moment came when allies controlling these lines wavered. Once stability returned, campaigns became isolated problems, rather than existential threats. Caesar could concentrate force where needed and shift rapidly when required. From early defensive operations, his conduct evolved into a constant offensive posture. Even when claiming injury or provocation, action remained aggressive. Temporary defensive pauses served only to restore momentum. Caesar preferred campaigning in favourable seasons, but demonstrated readiness for winter operations when necessary. Discipline was maintained through constant labour. Panic, such as that experienced early in Gaul, became a teaching tool. Adaptability defined leadership. Information gathering was relentless. Scouts, local allies, defectors, and spies fed intelligence. When information failed, Caesar forced clarity through movement. His expeditions beyond Gaul served as reconnaissance as much as conquest, though the risks taken were considerable. Numerical inferiority was common but not crippling. Caesar's strength lay in cohesion, morale, and speed. Allied troops were used selectively. Cavalry remained largely non-Roman. Forces were concentrated whenever possible, division being temporary and deliberate. Enemies were struck before they could unite. Movement compensated for numbers. Objectives were chosen carefully. Sometimes the goal was terrain, often the enemy army itself. Key towns and crossings mattered because they opened routes and denied enemy mobility. Camps were placed to protect communication and threaten supply lines. Bases were layered and reinforced. After hard lessons, caution increased, but boldness never disappeared. Caesar sought to fragment opposition. Diversions were frequent and effective. Enemies were misled about intentions, positions, and strength. Speed replaced secrecy. Care for soldiers existed alongside demands for extreme effort. Logistics were prioritized. Supplies were secured through alliances, tribute, and planning. Camps functioned as mobile fortresses, stabilizing morale and preserving combat power. Winter quarters were placed with political effect in mind. Tribes were accustomed to Roman presence gradually. Distribution of legions balanced deterrence and sustainability. Overextension produced disaster once and was not repeated. Setbacks triggered renewed energy rather than hesitation. Ancient warfare differs in form, not in principle. Caesar's campaigns reveal fundamentals recognizable in modern command. Study of such operations sharpens understanding of leadership, decision-making, and adaptation. The Roman army under Caesar was no longer a civic militia. It was a professional instrument shaped by its commander. Organization evolved, formation simplified, cohesion increased. The legion functioned through cohorts as its primary maneuver element. Traditional distinctions faded. Numbers varied, strength fluctuated, and structure adapted to conditions. Deployment allowed flexibility between dense movement and open fighting order. Command roles blurred between political and military authority. Officers were not always professionals, but discipline compensated. Baggage was minimized. Soldiers carried heavy personal loads. Camps were constructed daily. Engineers played a central role. Scouts screened movement. Veteran volunteers formed trusted inner circles. Everything served mobility and control. Caesar's army succeeded not because its men were inherently superior, but because leadership molded them. Discipline in battle surpassed rigidity in regulation. Confidence grew from repeated success under pressure. Opponents were capable and determined. Defeat came not from weakness, but from fragmentation. Gaul was ultimately subdued. Resistance lingered only in scattered forms. The transformation that followed reshaped the region permanently. Whatever judgment is made of Caesar's motives, the result was decisive. Order replaced instability. Power consolidated. History moved forward, carried by an army forged through ambition, endurance, and command. The men who served in Caesar's legions were not highly paid by later standards. Each soldier received an annual wage of 225 denarii, roughly equivalent to the income of an ordinary labourer. From this sum, deductions were made for food and clothing. What made service attractive was not the base pay, but the additional rewards. Loot taken in war, special distributions granted by the commander, and occasional bonuses could multiply a soldier's earnings many times over. A legionary's basic ration consisted primarily of grain, measured monthly rather than daily, and this was almost certainly supplemented with meat and whatever vegetables or fruit could be obtained through foraging. In battle, the legion did not fight as a single mass. It was arranged in layers, usually 2, 3, or occasionally 4 lines deep. The most common formation placed the cohorts in 3 staggered lines, allowing movement forward and backward without confusion. The spacing between these units was not rigidly fixed. Earlier Roman armies had maintained wide gaps, but by Caesar's time, these spaces had largely disappeared in actual combat. While some separation remained for maneuver, battle conditions tended to compress the formation, bringing the men close together for mutual support. The depth of the legion gave it great weight without destroying its ability to move. Compared to earlier phalanxes, Roman formations placed fewer men across the front, but compensated with flexibility and endurance. A force of several legions, drawn up in this manner, could cover a wide frontage while still retaining strong reserves. Defensive arrangements differed according to circumstance. When holding fortifications or camps, a single line often sufficed, with reserves positioned behind gates or critical points. In open terrain and under threat of encirclement, the legion could form a compact square or a rounded defensive body, presenting shields and weapons outward on all sides. Such defensive shapes were not rigid geometric figures. Terrain, pressure, and urgency shaped them. The objective was simple: prevent collapse, protect the baggage and wounded, and survive until relief or opportunity arrived. Against overwhelming forces, cohesion mattered more than elegance. The legion was drilled to adapt quickly, shifting from line to square and back again when conditions demanded. The cavalry operated very differently. Organized in small squadrons, it relied on speed and maneuver rather than shock. These mounted troops were not Roman citizens, but allies recruited from Gaul and Germany. Their formations were looser, their discipline less uniform, and their effectiveness varied widely. In many cases, infantrymen were placed among the horsemen to stabilize them during combat, an ancient solution to a persistent problem. Cavalry was useful for scouting, screening, pursuit, and countering enemy horse, but it rarely decided battles on its own. Movement was central to Roman warfare. A legion could rapidly shift from battle formation to marching order simply by turning to one side. In column, the troops followed one another in strict sequence, allowing the entire body to move through narrow roads, forests, and defiles. Depending on conditions, columns could be tightened or extended, compressed to pass obstacles or stretched out when terrain forced delays. The order of march changed regularly to distribute fatigue evenly among the units. When danger threatened, the army advanced with caution. The vanguard scouted ahead, probing the terrain and searching for signs of ambush. The main body followed, while a rear guard maintained order and protected against surprise. In hostile territory, baggage was concentrated and surrounded by troops, sometimes enclosed within marching squares, formed by the legions themselves. This arrangement allowed the army to move through enemy lands without exposing its most vulnerable elements. Daily marches were measured from camp to camp. A typical day covered 15 to 18 miles, usually completed before midday, to allow time for fortification. Rest days followed every few marches. Exceptional efforts were possible when urgency demanded, and Caesar's forces occasionally covered astonishing distances with minimal rest. Such feats required iron discipline and were not routine, but they demonstrated what trained troops could endure. By late season, only the far coastal marshlands in the northeast remained outside firm control. Their inhabitants avoided pitched battle and retreated into forests and wetlands, taking their goods with them and offering no towns to besiege. Caesar attempted to drive them out, cutting wide paths through woodland and building protective barriers from felled timber as the army advanced. The work was exhausting and slow, and storms began to close the campaign. With winter approaching, Caesar suspended the operation and placed his forces in winter quarters across more secure regions. At the opening of the year 55 BCE, a new crisis emerged along the northern frontier of Gaul. Several German groups, long displaced by the pressure of the Suebi, crossed the Rhine not far from its mouth. For 3 years they had wandered across the interior of Germany, searching for land. Now, driven by necessity, they forced their way westward, falling upon the territory of the Menapii with extreme violence. Entire districts were devastated, and the winter that followed was spent on Gallic soil. No one could be certain whether this movement marked a temporary raid or the beginning of a permanent settlement. These migrants belonged to the Usipetes and the Tencteri, peoples already hardened by years of displacement. Their original expulsion had come at the hands of the Suebi, a formidable confederation known for its austere lifestyle and military strength. The Suebi lived primarily on meat and dairy, hunted constantly, and rejected settled agriculture. Even in winter they wore little more than animal skins and bathed openly in rivers. Their cavalry fought as both horsemen and infantry, dismounting at will, with horses trained to remain in place until recalled. Luxury was despised, wine forbidden, and discipline severe. Their territory stretched vast distances, with large tracts intentionally left, desolate as a defensive buffer. It was from this violent pressure that the Usipetes and Tencteri were forced westward. Their migration involved an immense population, numbering hundreds of thousands, including warriors, families, and herds. They crossed the Rhine near the modern lower river crossings, pushing inland toward the Meuse. Their advance was likely encouraged by certain Gallic groups, who hoped that German settlement might weaken Roman dominance. Caesar returned to his legions unusually early that spring, gathering them from winter quarters in northern Gaul. He recognized the scale of the danger at once. A hostile population of this size could not be ignored. Swift action was required before the situation hardened into a permanent threat. At a general assembly near Samarobriva, Caesar avoided openly accusing the Gallic tribes of complicity. Instead, he relied on persuasion, securing supplies, auxiliary troops, and a substantial cavalry force. By early May, the Roman army moved eastward through the heart of northern Gaul, advancing toward the Meuse. Reports indicated that the German host lay further ahead, spread across open ground near the river systems of the region. Before direct contact was made, German envoys arrived, seeking negotiation. They requested recognition of the lands they had already taken and proposed coexistence. Caesar rejected this outright. No German settlement west of the Rhine would be permitted. He suggested that territory might instead be found east of the river among the Ubii, who were themselves under pressure from the Suebi and had requested Roman assistance. The German envoys appeared to accept this proposal, but requested time to consult their leadership. Caesar refused delay. He suspected the negotiations were merely a tactic to gain time until German cavalry, then absent on raids, could return. Advancing cautiously, he soon encountered the enemy again. Further embassies repeated the same appeals for delay. Caesar consented only to a short movement forward to secure water for the army. What followed changed the course of events dramatically. As Roman cavalry advanced, they were suddenly attacked by a smaller German mounted force. The engagement ended in disorder, with Roman auxiliaries driven back and heavy losses inflicted. German tactics proved effective and aggressive, combining mounted shock with sudden dismounted assaults aimed directly at the horses. When the triumvirate first took control of Roman politics, Pompey was widely regarded as the dominant figure. Caesar and Crassus were seen, at least on the surface, as partners of lesser weight. The resources of the state were opened fully to Pompey, while Caesar received only what the law explicitly granted him. Pompey's authority had no fixed end. Caesar's command, though long, was clearly limited in time. Pompey remained in Rome, at the heart of power. Caesar was sent far from the capital to a distant and unstable province. Yet the arrangement soon exposed its weakness. The task entrusted to Pompey, the management of Rome itself, revealed his inability to control the city. Rival factions tore the capital apart. Armed gangs roamed openly, elections were bought or forced, and violence became routine. Rome descended into near anarchy, and Pompey proved incapable of restoring order. Street leaders acted without restraint, following their own ambitions. Authority dissolved. Pompey's prestige, once unquestioned, began to erode. He was gradually reduced to a figurehead, pulled in different directions by forces he could no longer command. At the same time, Caesar was winning victories in the north. His name was becoming synonymous with success, while Pompey's military reputation faded into memory. Losing control of the streets meant losing control of the assemblies, and without them, Pompey's political strength weakened. His failure to fulfill his role within the joint rule inevitably created distance between him and Caesar. The imbalance began to work against Caesar as well, since he was far from Rome and increasingly unable to influence events directly. Power was slipping, and neither man trusted the stability of the arrangement. In the spring of 56, the triumvirs met at Lucca. The gathering was immense. Hundreds of senators and leading figures attended. The provinces were redistributed once more, but the outcome revealed a shift. Pompey yielded a substantial share of influence to Caesar. The balance was changing. Meanwhile, the aristocratic factions regrouped. Opposition hardened, yet discipline was absent everywhere. Each powerful man acted independently. Caesar raised legions without authorization. Crassus launched his eastern campaign without restraint. Legal forms were observed only in appearance. Elections were decided by money or force. Armed clashes in the streets became so frequent that violence ceased to shock. This chaos culminated in the killing of Clodius, an event that finally stirred Pompey into action. For a brief moment, authority was reasserted, order partially restored, and Pompey assumed extraordinary power. Crassus, long the mediator between his two partners, leaned steadily toward Caesar. The redistribution of provinces offered him a chance to gain both glory and wealth through war in the east. Pompey's earlier diplomatic failures had opened the way. Crassus envisioned a campaign on the scale of Alexander's conquests and marched into Syria with vast ambition. Two invasion routes lay before him: through Armenia with allied support, or directly across the Mesopotamian desert. He chose the latter, trusting a local ruler whose advice proved disastrous. With 7 legions, cavalry, and missile troops, Crassus led nearly 50,000 men into open country. Poor reconnaissance led him directly into a trap near Carrhae. The Parthian commander understood the limits of Roman infantry and avoided direct engagement. Armenian cavalry was neutralized elsewhere. The Parthians fought entirely with horsemen, combining heavy armoured lancers with mounted archers. On the open plains, mobility decided everything. Roman legions, invincible in close combat, found themselves powerless. The enemy chose when to fight and when to withdraw. Communications were cut. Water was scarce. The desert offered no shelter. Roman formations, dense and disciplined, became targets for relentless missile fire. The Parthians carried vast reserves of arrows on camels. Roman archers were ineffective. Attempts to counterattack failed. Crassus sent his son Publius forward with a selected force. The maneuver briefly disrupted the enemy, but it was a feint. Isolated, surrounded, and overwhelmed, the detachment was annihilated. Darkness alone saved what remained of the Roman army. Thousands of wounded were abandoned. Retreat followed retreat. Crassus was killed. The army ceased to exist. The defeat shocked the Roman world. With Crassus gone, the triumvirate collapsed. Caesar and Pompey stood alone, already estranged. The death of Julia, Caesar's daughter and Pompey's wife, severed the last personal bond. Pompey soon secured sole political authority and prepared for confrontation. Crassus's death removed the one man Caesar could rely on completely. At the same time, Gaul erupted under Vercingetorix. A recall of Caesar at that moment might have ended his career, but Pompey hesitated, as he always did. Caesar remained committed to the popular cause. Pompey drifted back toward the aristocracy. Alliances shifted. Caesar sought compromise, hoping to secure the consulship legally and maintain peace. Legal maneuvers blocked him. Orders were issued demanding the disbandment of his legions. Caesar proposed mutual disarmament. Pompey refused. As Caesar completed the pacification of Gaul, the Senate, manipulated by Pompey's supporters, moved toward open conflict. Tribunes opposing the measures were driven from Rome. They fled north to Caesar. That flight gave him legitimacy. War became unavoidable. Caesar acted decisively. One legion was summoned to Ravenna. Others remained far away in winter quarters. An ultimatum sent to Rome was rejected. The order came for unconditional surrender. Caesar refused. The Rubicon was crossed in mid-December. Civil war began. Caesar advanced rapidly. Town after town opened its gates. Pompeian commanders withdrew or defected. Soldiers preferred the proven victor. Caesar treated enemies with clemency, reinforcing his image as a restorer rather than a destroyer. Panic spread in Rome. Magistrates fled. Pompey abandoned the capital without securing defences or resources. Pompey attempted to regroup in southern Italy but delayed, delegated, and hesitated. Caesar pressed forward relentlessly. Forces opposing him dissolved. At Corfinium, Pompeian troops mutinied against their own commander and surrendered. Caesar spared all leaders and returned seized funds. This act of mercy transformed public opinion. Fear turned to support. Pompey retreated to Brundisium, preparing to leave Italy. Caesar pursued, hoping to trap him. Fortifications rose around the port. Engineering works pushed into the harbour. Floating barriers and towers challenged the fleet. Pompey responded skillfully, fortifying the city and masking his movements. Under cover of night, he embarked and escaped to Greece. Only a few ships were lost. Italy lay in Caesar's hands. In 60 days, without pitched battle, he controlled the peninsula. Pompey held vast resources abroad but had surrendered the political heart of the Republic. Caesar now bore new responsibilities. Garrisons were required. Grain supplies were vulnerable. The war expanded across the Mediterranean. Caesar reorganized rapidly. Sicily and Sardinia were secured without resistance. Africa became contested. Pompey gathered strength in the east. Caesar turned his attention westward, towards Spain, where Pompey's legions posed a direct threat. Pompey's strategy had failed. He had misjudged time, initiative, and popular sentiment. Caesar's success rested not on chance, but on speed, unity of command, and moral authority. One side held territory and tradition. The other held momentum. Pompey did not lack intelligence, but he never matched Caesar's speed of thought or his appetite for constant action. Even so, there was no iron law forcing him to abandon the Italian peninsula. With firmer nerve and even modest preparation, he could have stayed and made Caesar's advance far more dangerous. War is built on readiness, and Pompey had done almost nothing to get ready. His habits leaned toward delay, compromise, and letting events drift. If he had started recruiting early in Italy and the eastern provinces, if he had brought even part of his veteran force from Spain across to Italy in time, Caesar's chosen path could have been blocked so hard that the entire gamble might have failed. Even Pompey's personal appearance in Picenum could have changed everything. At his best, Pompey had a presence that drew men to him and steadied wavering allies. And if Rome itself felt too exposed to hold, he still had options. He could have anchored himself at a strong coastal position and used the sea as his shield, because the coastline was effectively under his fleet's control. From there, calling in manpower and resources from the provinces, he could have gathered an army that outnumbered Caesar by a wide margin. Sitting still while an opponent presses every advantage is an invitation to disaster, and Pompey's decision to retreat without a fight created exactly the kind of momentum Caesar lived for. Caesar, in other campaigns and against competent resistance, often showed careful restraint. If he had known that Pompey stood in person at the head of fresh troops, waiting across his route as soon as Caesar reached Ancona, he might have moved less quickly and with more caution. At that early stage, he had not yet measured Pompey as fully as he would later. Pompey's first major mistake was entering a crisis without preparing for war. The second, even worse, was giving up Italy without testing the situation. Caesar's choices after Pompey's withdrawal raised their own doubts. It is not obvious that Caesar made the best decision by turning towards Spain instead of pursuing Pompey immediately. Every month he allowed Pompey was a month Pompey could use to gather soldiers, ships, money, and allies in the east, turning into a larger and more dangerous opponent. Spain was rich and strategically important, and Caesar could not ignore a hostile army at his back. Yet leaving Italy to march away from Pompey, instead of pressing him before he consolidated, risked surrendering part of the psychological advantage Caesar had won by bold speed and by the shock of Pompey's retreat. Caesar marched overland to Spain, a long and difficult effort. Why not march through Illyricum toward Greece and drive Pompey into a corner while he was still unsettled and unsure? One explanation is that Caesar thought he understood Pompey's temperament, that he believed Pompey would not dare return to Italy once he had crossed to Greece. But that assumption depended on Pompey continuing to behave with a strangely passive softness in a situation that demanded urgency. It was dangerous to build strategy on the hope that an enemy would remain unmilitary. Caesar's own brief later struggle in Epirus, when Pompey finally had time to shape his eastern army, showed how costly that delay could be. The reasoning Caesar later offered in his own account does not fully explain why he chose Spain first. A memorable saying can sound decisive, but a saying does not replace a real explanation. He famously framed the plan as wanting to fight an army without its leader, so that later he could face a leader without an army. But that line alone cannot carry the weight of the decision. A more practical view is that Caesar feared political trouble inside Italy if he sailed east too soon. His absence might encourage factions at Rome, while the Pompeian legions in Spain, easy to move by sea to Italy if conditions shifted, could have been used to stir unrest. Caesar may have believed Pompey would lure him away from his strongest base, which was Italy supported by resources and veterans from Gaul. By removing the Spanish threat first, Caesar could try to secure Italy beyond doubt before turning to the main contest. Yet the question still hangs in the air. Could Caesar not have pinned the Spanish army near the Pyrenees with a smaller veteran force and still struck Pompey earlier through Illyricum? Pompey in Greece, with vast networks and money, may have been the greater danger. And how could Caesar be certain Pompey would not turn back the moment Caesar left Italy? These are judgments made from incomplete evidence, because Caesar's own narrative reveals little about his private calculations. What is clear is that he committed to the Spanish campaign. After distributing his legions for rest in major towns, he went to Rome and had the tribunes summon what remained of the Senate on March 3rd. He presented his complaints, insisting that Pompey should follow the same legal limits he claimed he was willing to accept. And he proposed sending envoys to open reconciliation. No one wanted the role. Pompey had already declared that those who stayed in Rome were enemies, no different from those who stood beside Caesar in the field. Caesar's grip on Rome was strong, but he still faced hostility and suspicion. Before leaving the city, he seized the emergency funds stored in the treasury for a defense against the Gauls, arguing that since the Gauls had been defeated, there was no longer a need for that reserve. A tribune tried to stop him, and Caesar threatened him with a drawn sword, making it brutally clear that words and law would not block the demands of war. The money vanished quickly into the costs of the army. Not long after, Caesar found himself borrowing from officers to keep his legions paid. A striking moment in which even the master of Rome had to rely on private resources to feed the engine of conquest. Many citizens watched this stripping of the treasury with disbelief, but they could do nothing. Authority had moved from institutions to the man holding the army. At that moment, Caesar's forces were spread from Gaul down towards Sicily. He was not tightly gathered, and his new plan required rapid reshuffling. Fresh recruits were posted in Apulia and along the Adriatic coast, with garrisons placed in good harbours to secure the shoreline. Several legions were ordered back toward Gaul to support movements in the west. In southern Gaul, key forces were concentrated, while political and military responsibilities were distributed to trusted men. One figure to manage affairs at Rome, another to command in Italy, and others to oversee neighbouring regions. Caesar even freed a Jewish king who had been held in Rome, hoping the man's return would disrupt Pompeian recruitment in Syria. When these arrangements were set, Caesar departed Rome on March 9th, headed into Transalpine Gaul, and then followed the coast toward Massilia, reaching its vicinity in roughly 12 days. While Caesar moved, Pompey's agents also moved. A messenger Caesar had released earlier travelled to Spain to act as Pompey's representative. A prominent Pompeian enemy, formerly assigned to govern Gaul by Senate appointment, gathered supporters, obtained ships, and sailed to Massilia. Caesar heard along the way that the city had secured surrounding grain, strengthened defences, and that Pompey's supporters had pushed the population toward open resistance. Mountain tribes nearby were brought into the alliance, increasing the threat. When Caesar arrived, he tried persuasion first, inviting leading citizens to meet him. For once, his famous ability to win minds did not break the wall. The city's magistrates claimed they owed favours to both leaders and could not, in good conscience, allow either side to occupy their harbour or streets. During the negotiations, the Pompeian commander arrived with a fleet, entered the harbour and was made the city's military head. Caesar, lacking ships on the spot, could not prevent it. The Pompeian commander immediately began expanding the naval threat. Merchant ships in the harbour and nearby were seized, their cargoes confiscated, especially grain, and stockpiled for a siege. The defection of an important coastal city in a region Caesar considered secure was an insult and a real strategic problem. With help from allied tribes, the city could threaten the land route from Italy into Spain, and its example could encourage other wavering communities. Caesar could not simply march away and leave it behind. He began assembling a blockade and siege effort, because Massilia, standing on the Mediterranean, mattered far beyond its walls. In an astonishingly short time, new ships were built and prepared at a nearby port, placed under an experienced commander known for earlier coastal victories. Another officer was left with several legions to invest the city by land. Caesar began building siege lines, while reinforcements were ordered to hurry and redirect their march towards Spain. At the same time, Caesar sent a trusted subordinate into Spain with legions already positioned in southern Gaul, instructing him to seize the Pyrenean passes before Pompey's Spanish commanders could lock them down. Speed won the first round. A small Pompeian force was driven out of the passes, and Caesar's troops descended into Spain before the defence could solidify. In Spain, the Pompeian military structure was powerful but divided. Pompey's overall representative arrived with instructions to supervise, yet each commander held authority over his own army and region. Together, they controlled 7 legions, spread across the peninsula. One commander held 3 legions in the northeast, another had 2 near a major river line in the west, and the third had 2 farther south and west. As news arrived from Italy and Massilia, the commanders shifted. Forces concentrated near Ilerda, a city by the river Sicaris, leaving one commander to hold the western regions. The combined army near Ilerda was strengthened with auxiliaries and cavalry raised in Spain, producing a formidable field force. Exact numbers are uncertain, because legions in the field rarely matched paper strength, but the Pompeian army likely stood somewhere between 65 and 87,000, when counting auxiliaries and horse, depending on how depleted each unit truly was. Caesar's available strength was smaller but more seasoned. He had an advance force already in Spain, with 3 legions, with 3 more to arrive, plus allied infantry and cavalry drawn from Gaul, Germanic recruits, and new levies selected from hardy mountain populations. If Caesar's cohorts were under strength, his field army may have been under 40,000. Yet, it was experienced, cohesive, and led by officers hardened in years of campaigning. While numbers mattered, morale and leadership mattered too, and Caesar relied on those qualities as much as on arithmetic. Money was now a problem. Caesar had poured the treasury funds and his remaining resources into keeping his legions paid. To secure loyalty on the eve of Romans fighting Romans, he adopted a method that was unusual and revealing. He borrowed from tribunes and centurions and then handed the money out among the common soldiers. The troops received direct benefit and felt bound to him. The officers who had lent money became personally invested in his success. It was a practical chain of dependency built inside the army at exactly the moment when discipline and allegiance could decide everything. The campaign around Ilerda unfolded in hard terrain, shaped by river and rock. From the Ebro toward the region, land rose and broke into hills, and in Caesar's time, much of it still carried forest. North of Ilerda, the ground flattened, and the city itself dominated the landscape, perched on a bold rocky height beside the Sicaris. The place was excellent for local defence, but it was not an ideal strategic anchor for controlling the Spanish interior. The true defensive line should have been the Ebro, yet Pompey's commanders failed to secure it and even failed to maintain strong communications with it. After losing the Pyrenean passes through delay, they pinned their hopes on Ilerda alone, trusting the advantages of its immediate position. When Caesar's advance commander reached the area around April 20th, he found the Pompeian camp established south of the city, on an isolated hill on the river's right bank, with cavalry stationed in the plain between camp and water. The city itself was extremely difficult to storm. A smaller rise of ground lay between the hill camp and the city, and the Pompeians intended to remain defensive until Pompey supposedly arrived, carried along by rumour that he was moving towards Spain. The rumour had no real foundation, but it shaped their caution. They had food stores inside the city, though not enough for an endless wait, yet they believed they could block Caesar from reaching the interior. The Caesarian camp was placed upstream on the right bank, braced between small streams that ran into the river. Messages were sent to neighbouring communities to test loyalties. In mid-May, the 3 legions marching from Italy arrived. Bridges were built across the Sicaris, giving Caesar's side mobility on both banks, while the Pompeians controlled a solid stone bridge near the city. Both armies foraged across the water because supplies on their immediate bank dwindled, and skirmishing became routine. Then, a sudden mishap created a dangerous opening. On May 21st, during a foraging operation protected by cavalry and 2 legions, the lower Caesarian bridge collapsed under weight and high water, leaving the infantry isolated on the far bank. The soldiers continued forward, not fully grasping the risk. Pompey's commander read the situation quickly. He marched 4 legions and all his cavalry across the stone bridge and attacked the cut-off force. The Caesarian officer in command took a strong position on rising ground and formed a defensive arrangement designed to resist cavalry pressure, holding long enough for help to arrive. Reinforcements came by a forced march over the upper bridge, and the Pompeian force withdrew before serious damage was done. The broken bridge was repaired, but the incident showed how quickly the river could turn the campaign. 2 days later, Caesar himself arrived with a cavalry escort. After studying the landscape, he acted without delay, driven by the belief that time favoured Pompey in the east. He left small detachments to guard camp, bridges, and baggage, and marched the bulk of the army toward Ilerda in battle formation, offering battle directly. Pompey's commanders displayed their troops but refused to commit. They preferred to wait, trusting the strength of their position. Caesar refused to give them the satisfaction of watching him withdraw. He kept his lines in place through the day, and while 2 lines remained ready to fight, the 3rd quietly began cutting the first trench of a new camp extremely close to the enemy, about 2,000 feet from the foot of the hill. No rampart was raised at first, so the enemy would not see the work so clearly and strike during construction, and also because materials for palisades were not easily available, without exposing troops on long gathering runs. It was a daring approach, and arguably reckless, camping exposed on open ground within striking distance of a fortified hill. Yet Caesar persisted, extending the fortifications day by day, while keeping a strong covering force behind the forward trench. When the ditch was finished, the rampart went up, and the baggage and detachments from the upstream camp were moved into the new position. The site was uncomfortable and risky, but it served a purpose. It restricted Pompeian access to foraging on the right bank and increased pressure on their supply situation. Caesar then tried a sharp tactical move. Between the Pompeian camp and the city lay a plain and, within it, a modest ridge or hill with steep sides. The Pompeians had neglected to fortify it. If Caesar seized it, he could threaten the enemy's connection to the city's supplies and complicate movement toward the bridge that made their left bank foraging possible. The idea was strong, but execution failed. The hill lay closer to the enemy, which meant Caesar needed surprise, ideally a night occupation. Instead, he attempted to disguise his aim by drawing up 3 legions as if offering battle, extending the line across the front. 1 legion was meant to surge toward the hill at the decisive moment. Pompey's commanders watched carefully, and they reacted faster than Caesar expected. Guards already posted in the right place reached the hill first and threw back Caesar's initial assault. Reinforcements did not change the result. Caesar's men were forced back toward their standards. The fighting that followed revealed a striking difference in style. The Pompeian veterans, hardened by years of war in Spain, fought in a looser, more flexible manner than Caesar's legionaries were used to. Instead of pressing in dense lines, they split into smaller groups, using folds in the terrain for cover, advancing and withdrawing in bursts. If pressure mounted, they stepped back without panic, ready to reappear from another angle. Against that shifting pattern, Caesar's troops felt exposed on the flank and uncertain about how to engage. When the forward ranks fell back from the contested hill, the retreat rippled wider and a sense of insecurity spread. Caesar moved personally to crush that hesitation. He brought forward a neighbouring legion, covered the withdrawal, and launched a hard counterattack that pushed the enemy back. Some Pompeian troops retreated over the disputed ground toward the city, others back toward their camp. The clash surged toward Ilerda's southern approach, a narrow slope running up toward the fortified height. There, Caesar's attackers advanced too far. The enemy, backed by the safety of the walls and higher ground, turned and fought with confidence. The battlefield tightened into a steep corridor where only a few cohorts could fight abreast. Caesar's cavalry could not help on that rocky incline, and there was no room to flank. The only retreat path was the same narrow route they had climbed. For 5 hours the struggle burned in that confined space. Caesar rotated in fresh cohorts when possible, and the enemy did the same through their safer access routes. Armour and shields reduced killing power, and neither side broke easily. Eventually, Caesar's men ran low on javelins, and the enemy surged forward, sensing a moment to crush them. The situation threatened to turn into a serious defeat. Caesar urged one final effort. His troops drew swords and charged uphill in a desperate push that drove the enemy back almost to the walls. Under cover of that charge, they withdrew, down to ground where cavalry could finally play a role, riding along the edges to discourage pursuit and stabilize the retreat. Losses were not enormous by ancient standards, though they were painful. Caesar's force suffered a modest number, killed and several hundred wounded. The enemy lost a similar number killed, with officer casualties among them. Each side claimed success in its own way. Caesar's camp argued that the enemy had been forced back to the gates and driven uphill by swordwork. Pompey's men insisted they had held the contested ground and could now fortify it, which they did, building strong works and placing a garrison. Strategically, the pressure continued. Caesar's cavalry was superior and could dominate the wider countryside, watching crossings and making Pompeian foraging harder. Caesar believed hunger would eventually force the enemy out. Yet the fight had shown something unsettling. In this first serious clash against Romans rather than foreign enemies, Caesar had not achieved what he set out to do. Against a commander of lesser fame, his plan had been read and countered, and the result looked more like a check than a triumph. 2 days later, nature delivered a harsher blow than any spear. A violent storm and flood, driven by mountain meltwater, swelled the river and swept away Caesar's bridges. Water surged over banks, and even Caesar's camp was flooded by a stream running through it. Suddenly, Caesar was cut off from Gaul and trapped between rivers without a crossing, while Pompey's army still held its stone bridge at the city. No ford lay within easy distance. The surrounding area had already been stripped of grain, making foraging difficult, and enemy light troops continued constant harassment. Some Pompeian auxiliaries could cross the river easily using flotation methods common in their region, but Caesar could no longer interfere with Pompeian foraging on the far bank. Worse still, his convoys could not reach him. A party of foragers had been prevented from returning. Friendly communities could not deliver food, and new crops were not ready. Livestock had been driven away. Boats were unavailable because the enemy had secured them earlier. Rations dropped sharply. Pompey's commanders, by contrast, were well supplied and could pull provisions from the interior. The danger increased when a large convoy approaching from Gaul came into play, packed with non-combatants and officials, moving without strict order because it did not know Caesar's bridges were gone. Pompey's commanders learned of it and marched out with legions and cavalry to destroy it. The convoy was nearly swallowed, and only the stubborn courage and skill of Caesar's Gallic cavalry saved it from total capture. They skirmished aggressively, holding the enemy at a distance, and forced the convoy back toward higher ground. Losses still occurred, but catastrophe was avoided. In Caesar's camp, scarcity became severe and prices rose sharply. Soldiers weakened under poor rations, and foraging had to reach farther and farther. Reports carried back toward Rome, described in detail by the Pompeian side, encouraged the belief that Caesar's run of fortune was ending. If Pompey himself had appeared in Spain at that moment, Caesar could have faced genuine ruin. Instead, Pompey remained in the east, content to wait for a later showdown. With food tight and time pressing, Caesar turned to improvisation. He decided he had to restore contact with Gaul and secure the convoy, no matter the difficulty. Drawing on techniques learned in earlier campaigns, he built light boats with wooden frames covered by woven material and hides. These were hauled overland by wagons at night for many miles to a prepared site upstream. There, troops crossed quickly, seized a hill on the opposite bank without being noticed, and fortified it. With that foothold secured, a bridge was built from both sides under protection, completed in only 2 days. Supplies and foragers crossed safely back to Caesar's side. He then sent cavalry across in force and struck enemy foragers at the right moment, capturing men and provisions. When enemy light troops rushed to help, the cavalry split roles, with one part guarding captured supplies, while another attacked the rescuers, destroying a cohort and driving the rest back in disorder. 2. In a short time, the earlier advantage held by Pompey's commanders evaporated, and Caesar's army breathed again. While this struggle played out in Spain, the blockade at Massilia also produced a decisive moment at sea. Near an island off the city, the fleet defending Massilia came out in strength, using more warships and many smaller craft filled with archers and allied fighters. Caesar's fleet, recently built and crewed by men with little seamanship, met them anyway. The defenders relied on speed and skilled pilots trying to outmaneuver, surround, and shear off oars. Caesar's ships were heavier and less responsive, built in haste from green timber, and their crews were still learning basic nautical work. But when ships closed and the fight turned into boarding actions, the advantage shifted. Caesar's vessels carried tough veterans who wanted this service and knew how to fight at close quarters. Grappling hooks pulled enemy ships in, decks became battlefields, and the defenders lost the benefit of graceful maneuver. Several ships were sunk, others captured with crews aboard, and the rest were driven back into harbour. The defenders suffered heavy losses in ships that day. News of that naval success travelled fast and lifted Caesar's standing in Spain. It was presented as a major victory, and whether exaggerated or not, it had the desired political effect. Communities began to lean towards Caesar, offering support and grain. Towns and tribes declared loyalty, supplies arrived, and even a unit within the enemy camp defected outright. In a campaign where perception could sway alliances as much as swords, momentum mattered, and Caesar, as always, worked to ensure momentum stayed on his side. Caesar's aim was no longer simply to defeat the Pompeian army in open battle. He wanted to neutralize it intact. Destroying Roman legions meant years of bitterness and wasted strength. Capturing them meant removing Pompey's power, without deepening the civil wound. After restoring his supply line, Caesar began to shape the final phase of the campaign with that goal clearly in mind. The bridge he had just built lay far upstream, many miles from Ilerda. The river was still swollen and dangerous, making another conventional bridge closer to the battlefield difficult and risky. Instead of forcing the problem in the usual way, Caesar turned again to engineering. In the wide riverbed above the town lay low, sandy islands, where the Sicaris split into multiple channels. Caesar ordered a network of canals cut across one of these islands. By diverting part of the current into many smaller beds, the water level dropped enough to create shallow crossings. The result was not a bridge, but an artificial ford. The solution was simple, fast, and effective. This new crossing changed everything. Caesar could now move cavalry and infantry across the river, close to the enemy's position. The Pompeian commanders immediately understood the danger. Their advantage of position was slipping away, and Caesar's horsemen were now free to range on both banks. Afranius and Petreius decided that remaining near Ilerda was no longer safe. Their answer was retreat. The goal was the Ebro River, where they hoped to regain freedom of movement and draw the war into regions more favourable to Pompey. They crossed the Sicaris on their stone bridge and began to withdraw. Caesar followed almost at once, using the new ford. The Pompeians aimed for the mountain routes that led south and west, believing the rough terrain would protect them from Caesar's cavalry. Caesar anticipated the move, pushed rapidly ahead, and cut across their line of retreat. When they attempted to turn back toward Ilerda, he followed again, pressing hard. The Pompeian legions called for battle, confident in their numbers. Caesar refused. His intention was clear: victory without slaughter. As the pursuit tightened, water became the decisive factor. Caesar's cavalry seized wells, blocked access to streams, and denied the enemy relief. With thirst rising and movement restricted, the Pompeian army found itself trapped. Eventually, surrounded and cut off from water, Afranius and Petreius had no remaining option. The entire force surrendered under terms that allowed the soldiers to be discharged rather than destroyed. Without a major pitched battle, Caesar had removed Pompey's entire Spanish army from the war. The campaign around Ilerda, lasting roughly 6 weeks, ended as one of the most striking examples of strategic maneuver in Roman history. From that moment, momentum shifted decisively. Caesar's Gallic cavalry dominated the countryside. Pompeian foragers no longer dared to roam freely. Sometimes they ventured only short distances from camp, keeping escape routes open. At other times they tried long detours to avoid patrols, only to flee at the first sight of Caesar's horsemen, abandoning their loads. Eventually they resorted to foraging at night, a sign of growing anxiety. Meanwhile, tribes near and far, seeing which way fortune had turned, began to abandon Afranius and send Caesar grain and cattle. Even rumours that Pompey was marching through Africa towards Spain quietly faded away. With confidence growing, Caesar refined his control of the battlefield. The artificial ford allowed rapid movement without reliance on fragile bridges. Cavalry could now strike suddenly, appear where least expected, and withdraw just as quickly. Afranius and Petreius, already shaken, saw their situation worsening. Once Caesar controlled both banks of the Sicaris, the Pompeians faced a stark reality. They could no longer sit and wait. A decision had to be made, and it had to be made quickly. After long debate, the Pompeian commanders resolved to retreat toward Celtiberia, beyond the Ebro. That region had old loyalties to Pompey and offered the hope of prolonging the war until winter. Snow in the Pyrenees might disrupt Caesar's links with Gaul, and unfamiliar territory could slow his advance. Preparations were made along the Ebro near the junction with the Sicaris, where boats were gathered and a floating bridge ordered built. The easiest road followed the right bank of the Sicaris, but that route would expose them to relentless cavalry pursuit. Fearing this, the Pompeians chose the harsher road on the far bank through broken and waterless country. By late June, 2 legions were moved across the Sicaris, and a fortified bridgehead was established. Yet the withdrawal came too late. Caesar had already begun moving men across the ford, first cavalry, then infantry struggling through chest-deep water. The delay proved fatal. Afranius and Petreius realized they were losing their chance and prepared for a hurried escape. Despite earlier successes, they were unwilling to face Caesar in open battle. The reputation he had built, even without a decisive victory, weighed heavily on them. On the night of June 23rd, leaving a small force behind at Ilerda, the Pompeian army slipped away toward its new camp. Each soldier carried over 3 weeks of grain. The land ahead was first gentle, then increasingly rugged, finally breaking into rocky hills near the Ebro. If the march had been fast and disciplined, pursuit might have failed. But Caesar acted at once. His cavalry crossed the river and struck the enemy's rear before dawn, spreading confusion and slowing the column. Caesar had abandoned any idea of forcing battle. His aim was to exhaust, surround, and break morale. The Pompeians faced a difficult choice of routes. One ran close to the river through flatter country. The other climbed inland across broken hills. They chose the latter, believing the terrain would shield them from cavalry. It did not. The ground proved passable enough for Caesar's horsemen, who clung to their rear relentlessly. From the heights on the opposite bank, Caesar's infantry could watch the effect. The enemy's movement slowed, cohesion weakened, and confidence ebbed. Caesar's own legions, trapped between rivers, with only a distant bridge behind them, understood what was at stake. Seeing the enemy slipping away meant weeks of pursuit into unknown country. The soldiers pressed their officers, insisting they were ready to cross the river, despite the danger. Caesar accepted their resolve. Leaving weaker troops behind to guard camp and taking no baggage, he formed a crossing. Cavalry broke the current upstream and stood ready below to catch any man swept off his feet. The legions waded in. Some stumbled, but all were pulled to safety. Not a single soldier was lost. Once across, Caesar formed his army and advanced at speed. Despite the long detour and the struggle through the ford, his legions reached the Pompeian rear by mid-afternoon. The enemy, delayed by cavalry attacks, had covered only a few miles since midnight. Forced to halt, Afranius drew up on rising ground. Caesar paused as well, allowing his men to rest. He would not attack directly, but every time the Pompeians moved, he advanced again. In this way, both armies drifted southwest, skirmishing constantly. Afranius now sought refuge in a rugged defile to the south, where cavalry would be useless. If he could reach it, escape remained possible. Caesar read the intention and prepared to block it. Exhaustion clouded Pompeian judgment. Instead of pushing immediately, they delayed. Night fell. An attempted stealthy withdrawal was discovered, and Caesar's signals convinced Afranius that a night move would be too dangerous. Morning brought more indecision. Debates continued. Some urged a night march, others feared chaos in darkness. The decision to wait until daylight sealed their fate. Before dawn, Caesar acted. He marched early, sending his troops out of camp in the opposite direction, creating the illusion of retreat. The Pompeians believed the danger had passed. Under cover, Caesar wheeled his columns through rough ground toward the mountains. The march was brutal. Soldiers climbed ravines, passed weapons hand to hand over rocks, and scrambled up cliffs. No one complained. The promise of cutting off the enemy sustained them. Only when Caesar's leading units appeared beyond their camp did Afranius realize the deception. Panic followed. Orders were shouted, camp abandoned, and the army rushed toward the defile. Caesar's cavalry tore into the flanks, slowing the column. It became clear that even if the Pompeians reached safety, much of their baggage and rear units would be lost. Caesar reached the mouth of the defile first and barred the way. The Pompeians were now trapped. Attempts to break through failed. A detachment sent to seize nearby high ground was destroyed by cavalry in full view of both armies. Morale collapsed. Caesar's officers and soldiers urged him to attack. The opportunity for a decisive massacre lay before them. Caesar refused. He trusted thirst and despair more than swords. He allowed the enemy to withdraw to a nearby hill and then sealed every exit with camps and outposts. Water access was cut. Pompeian soldiers, many of whom had served with Caesar before, began to talk openly with his men. Old friendships resurfaced. Centurions crossed lines. Some spoke of surrendering their commanders. Celebration spread through Caesar's camp. Leniency, not violence, was winning the war. One Pompeian commander wavered. The other reacted violently, killing Caesar's men caught inside the camp and forcing his soldiers to swear loyalty. Caesar responded calmly, releasing captured enemies unharmed and rewarding those who stayed with him. Discipline returned, but the damage was done. Desertions increased. Supplies vanished. Finally, retreat toward Ilerda was attempted again. Caesar pursued relentlessly, forcing the enemy away from water and into an exposed position. By early July, the Pompeian army was encircled, thirsty, starving, and broken in spirit. A final attempt to force a crossing failed. With no escape left, Afranius and Petreius asked for terms. Caesar refused private negotiation but agreed to speak publicly before both armies. He praised their restraint in avoiding bloodshed, reproached the killing of his men, and offered honourable conditions. The legions were to be disbanded. The commanders were to leave Spain. The agreement was accepted. Caesar provided food, returned captured property, and dismissed the soldiers. Some volunteered to join him. Most were escorted peacefully to the borders of Italy and sent home. Without a great battle, Pompey lost Spain and some of his most experienced troops. Caesar, through patience, speed, and control, had achieved victory, not by destruction, but by mastery of movement and morale. Caesar kept 2 legions under arms and placed them under the command of Cassius, assigning him the task of completing the pacification of Farther Spain. With this decision, the Western theatre was not merely stabilized, but brought firmly under control. The speed with which these campaigns unfolded was extraordinary even by Roman standards. Caesar crossed the Rubicon in mid-December, 49 BC. Within roughly 2 months, he had marched the full length of Italy without facing serious resistance. Pompey chose not to fight and instead abandoned the peninsula, sailing from Brundisium to Epirus. From Italy, Caesar turned immediately toward Massilia and Spain. By late May, he had reached Ilerda. After 6 weeks of manoeuvre rather than pitched battle, Afranius and Petreius surrendered in early July. In a span scarcely longer than the marches themselves, Caesar had secured Italy and rendered Pompey's Spanish forces ineffective. The rapid collapse of opposition reflected not only Caesar's energy but the absence of any coordinated resistance. Italy yielded almost the moment Caesar set foot upon it. No one dared challenge the conqueror of Gaul. While Caesar advanced westward into Spain, Pompey remained inactive. Fortune favoured Caesar, but it favoured him because it followed ability and relentless motion. He acted whenever opportunity appeared and avoided risk only when delay offered advantage. Pompey, by contrast, allowed events to pass without intervention. His inactivity undermined his lieutenants in Spain, who lost not only territory, but confidence. Caesar exploited this hesitation fully. The lack of initiative at the top filtered downward. The failure to strike Caesar, when floods endangered his position at Ilerda, revealed a deeper weakness. Leadership on one side was decisive, on the other, uncertain. The campaign around Ilerda stands as one of the clearest examples in ancient warfare of victory, achieved through maneuver alone. Caesar accomplished his objective without forcing a general battle. The creation of the ford across the Sicaris became a lasting example of bold and imaginative engineering. Few operations of the ancient world rival the Italian and Ilerda campaigns, except others led by Caesar himself. While Caesar operated in Spain, the siege of Massilia continued under Trebonius. The city resisted stubbornly. Its fleet attempted to break the blockade but suffered repeated defeats. Siege works advanced steadily, making surrender unavoidable. After Spain was secured as far as Gades, Caesar returned to Massilia. He accepted its submission and spared the city from destruction, though severe penalties followed. Pompey's original strategy had been to advance simultaneously from Italy and Spain into Gaul. Caesar's speed shattered that plan. Pompey now focused on raising forces in Greece. Not all went Caesar's way. He sent Curio to secure Sicily and Africa. Sicily was recovered quickly, restoring vital grain shipments to Rome. In Africa, however, Curio underestimated the opposition. His army was destroyed, allowing the Pompeian faction to establish firm control there. Caesar's access to Greece remained limited. Pompey controlled the sea and possessed greater numbers on land. Yet the moral balance favoured Caesar and his veteran legions. Preparations now turned toward a confrontation in Greece. Massilia itself was a formidable target. Founded centuries earlier by Greek settlers, it had grown wealthy through trade and colonization. Its harbour was excellent, its defences strong, and its position naturally protected. Trebonius established his camp on elevated ground opposite the eastern wall. Two main points of attack were chosen, one near the principal gate and another closer to the harbour. To bridge the ravine before the walls, a massive earthwork was constructed, rising to extraordinary height. The defenders employed powerful engines capable of hurling iron-tipped beams deep into Roman works. Standard equipment proved inadequate. Heavy timber, reinforced coverings, and elaborate protective structures were required. Progress was slow and costly. Caesar remained briefly to supervise before departing for Spain. During his absence, a major naval battle occurred. Pompeian reinforcements arrived by sea, and the defenders of Massilia assembled a large fleet, crewed by skilled sailors. Encouraged by their population, they sailed out to meet Brutus, who commanded Caesar's ships. The engagement was fierce and closely fought. Boarding actions followed, and ships grappled together amid chaos. In the end, Roman discipline prevailed. Most of the Massilian fleet was destroyed or captured. The harbour was sealed. Massilia was now fully isolated. Siege works intensified. A massive brick tower rose near the main gate, replacing vulnerable wooden structures. From it, covered approaches were pushed toward the walls. Despite countermeasures and flooding attempts by the defenders, the undermined walls began to fail. Facing imminent assault, the citizens appealed for a truce, requesting Caesar's presence. Trebonius granted it, acting under Caesar's instructions to avoid a sack. Discipline was strained. The army was professional, hardened, and not easily restrained. The truce was respected, though reluctantly. The defenders soon violated it. Taking advantage of a strong wind, they launched a sudden incendiary attack, burning months of Roman labour in an hour. The Romans responded decisively the next day, driving the attackers back. Reconstruction began immediately, this time using fire-resistant methods. The speed of recovery astonished the city. Resistance collapsed. Surrender became inevitable. In farther Spain, Varro had wavered until hearing rumours of Caesar's difficulties. He then openly declared for Pompey, raising troops, collecting funds, and seizing property. He chose Gades as his base and stockpiled resources there. Caesar responded swiftly. With only 2 legions, he advanced south. Cities declared for him almost universally. Varro's forces disintegrated. Even his legions defected. He surrendered without battle. Caesar restored confiscated property, rewarded loyalty, and secured the province. Spain was finished. Caesar returned eastward, reaching Massilia as it surrendered in early September. The city was spared, though disarmed and occupied. From there, Caesar proceeded to Italy. Pompey's first grand strategy had collapsed completely. Meanwhile, Curio's defeat in Africa remained the lone serious setback. His overconfidence and failure to reconnoitre allowed King Juba to destroy his army. Africa fell firmly into Pompeian hands. Despite this, Sicily remained secure, preventing famine in Italy. Naval fighting continued in Illyricum. Pompeian fleets defeated Caesar's commanders, capturing legions and limiting Roman control. Yet Pompey still failed to exploit his advantages fully. Caesar was elected consul for the following year and resigned the dictatorship. After brief administrative measures, he prepared to move east. Pompey dominated the sea and held superior numbers. Caesar resolved to cross the Adriatic in winter by surprise. At Brundisium, he assembled his legions, though shipping proved limited. Discipline faltered briefly, but Caesar restored order decisively. In late November, he embarked 7 legions and crossed successfully, landing in Epirus. Pompey had not expected such audacity. Caesar moved rapidly inland, securing towns that opened their gates willingly. Pompey rushed to the coast, barely saving Dyrrachium. Both armies settled along the Apsus River. Despite overwhelming numerical superiority, Pompey did not attack. He waited. Caesar waited for reinforcements. Naval actions followed. Pompey's admirals attempted to blockade Caesar, but Roman countermeasures limited their effectiveness. Bibulus, commanding the fleet, died from hardship. Command fragmented. Caesar continued to seek negotiations, but talks were disrupted by violence. Hostilities resumed fully. Antony eventually broke through the blockade with reinforcements after a dramatic pursuit and naval disaster for Pompey's fleet. Caesar and Antony joined forces. Pompey attempted to intercept, but failed. Once again, hesitation proved decisive. With his army united, Caesar took the initiative. Though still outnumbered, he pressed toward confrontation. Provinces began to declare for him. His lieutenants operated independently, securing supplies and allies. Pompey retreated toward the coast, choosing delay over battle. Longinus was in no position to stand and trade blows. His troops were fresh but thin, and the safest choice was to fall back toward the foothills, aiming for the route that led toward Ambracia. Scipio's cavalry pressed hard behind him, trying to turn the withdrawal into a collapse. Domitius, however, reacted with the kind of sharp timing that keeps a smaller force alive. Instead of chasing shadows, he made an immediate show of force against Favonius, who was guarding Scipio's baggage and rear area. The threat was enough. News travelled fast, and Scipio was forced to break off the pursuit and hurry back to protect his supplies. He arrived just in time to prevent Domitius from striking, with both sides almost catching sight of each other at once. Observers later noted the strange moment when the dust of Domitius's marching column and the advance elements of Scipio's returning force appeared nearly together, like two storms forming on the same horizon. Domitius remained north of the river, while Scipio crossed farther upstream at a ford and took up a defensive camp. Between them stretched an open plain several miles wide, enough space for battle lines to form and maneuver. Scipio drew up his men in front of his position, as if ready to fight. Domitius advanced and clearly offered battle. There was skirmishing, a cautious advance, a display of battle order that carried the sound and rhythm of a coming clash. Then Scipio chose not to commit. Despite having crossed the Haliacmon to close with his enemy, he decided against a full engagement with Domitius's legions, which were eager and aggressive. He withdrew back across the river to his earlier ground. Two separate cavalry actions followed during their probing and reconnaissance. In both, Scipio's horse came off worse. Each commander tried to lure the other into a trap, but neither succeeded. Still, the exchanges favoured Domitius, and after that both forces settled into a tense pause. While this was unfolding, Caesar moved to tighten his own concentration. He reduced his scattered garrisons and pulled most detachments back toward the main army, leaving only a small force at Oricum under Acilius to guard the ships anchored in the bay. Acilius tried to secure the harbour mouth by sinking a merchant vessel and anchoring a warship nearby as a barrier. It was an intelligent improvisation, but it did not hold. Pompey's son, Cneius, commanding the Egyptian squadron and eager to prove himself, struck quickly. He captured the warship, cleared the obstruction, and forced entry into the harbour. Once inside, he set fire to most of Caesar's small fleet. Then, leaving an officer to maintain pressure and obstruct incoming supplies, he sailed north to Nymphaeum and pushed up toward Lissus, where he destroyed the transports Antony had held there. For Caesar, the loss was severe. Those ships were essentially his only tools for movement and communication on that side of the Adriatic. The raid did not succeed in taking Lissus itself, but the damage was done. In these actions, the younger Pompey displayed an offensive spirit that seemed absent from the older man's conduct at the time. After the failed attempt to trap Antony near Tirana, Pompey withdrew toward Dyrrachium. Keeping to his method of avoiding a decisive clash, he chose to defend the line of the Genesis River just south of the city and shifted to a new position near Asparagium. The exact placement is debated in later reconstructions, but the operational logic requires it to have been within a short march of the river mouth, on the southern bank, close enough to screen Dyrrachium while discouraging direct attack. Caesar, after joining Antony, returned to Scamper and launched a brief raid up the Genesus, aiming to seize a local centre held for Pompey. The name of that place has not survived clearly, but the purpose is evident. Remove hostile footholds, strip Pompey of local support, and keep the opponent off balance. After that, Caesar marched toward Pompey's new position and established a camp opposite him. The next day, Caesar drew his men out in battle order and offered an engagement. Pompey refused the invitation. He appeared outside his defences and held the higher ground, signalling readiness, while remaining in a position that would punish any direct assault. It was classic caution, visible defiance without the risk of being forced into a fight on unfavourable terms. Caesar did not linger, because waiting would only help the side with ships, supplies, and time. Instead, Caesar chose a move that carried real danger but promised a decisive advantage if it worked. The goal was to cut Pompey off from Dyrrachium, the coastal storehouse where his war material and provisions were concentrated. On March 3rd, Caesar set out on a long, concealed circuit over rough ground. The route climbed through wooded country, crossed broken hills and moved from one river system to another, demanding constant ascent and descent across tributaries and ridges. It was not a march made for comfort. The ground and the pace mattered, because the contest was not about fighting first, but arriving first. Pompey's direct line to Dyrrachium was shorter, straighter and easier. Caesar's line was longer and harsher. Success depended on one essential condition. Pompey had to remain unaware long enough for Caesar to gain the key heights. At first, Pompey did not understand what was happening. The movement looked like a shift of camp driven by supply pressure. Only when scouts confirmed the direction did the situation become clear. Pompey immediately turned onto the direct road toward his base, but the delay was fatal. Caesar drove his men hard, resting only briefly, reached the river valley that led toward the coast, and pushed down it with urgency. When the leading elements of Pompey's army finally came into view at a distance, Caesar was already on the heights that controlled access. He had effectively placed a barrier between Pompey and Dyrrachium. Caesar camped north of the river, on ground that rolled gently but sat in the right place, and the maneuver stood out as one of those operations that wins without a major battle. Pompey, cut off from the city though his garrison still held it, shifted to Petra on the southern side, a position near a small harbour. From there, supply could still move by sea in smaller craft, keeping him tied to Dyrrachium without giving Caesar an easy opening. The theatre around Dyrrachium shaped everything that followed. The bay curves like a drawn bow, and behind it rises a broken semicircle of hills and ridges feeding the local streams. Farther out stand higher hills that form a rugged frame. Inside them lie chalky ridges, hard and irregular. Closer to the shore, the terrain softens into rolling upland with patches of trees and cultivation. Ravines and gorges cut the back country, while the coastal strip opens into long beaches and gentler ground. Dyrrachium itself sits on a projecting point at the northwest end of the curve, confined by lagoons and narrow approaches. Any army trying to invest it from land risked being trapped on that foreland if the approaches were fortified. The city was a stronghold that made sense as a supply base, but it was also a trap for any besieger without naval control. Pompey now committed fully to a strategy of attrition. Supplies were ordered forward from the eastern provinces and client states, moved by ship with relative ease. Pompey had the sea, and the sea delivered food and material. Caesar, by contrast, was forced to scrape his provisions from land that could not sustain a long campaign. Illyricum was not rich in grain, Epirus could barely cover its own needs, and Pompeian foraging had already stripped much of what remained. With enemy fleets controlling the routes, Italy could not reliably send help. In practical terms, Caesar was being asked to fight time, geography, and logistics at the same moment. Seen from that angle, Pompey's method was not irrational. A patient commander could hope to starve a superior tactician into mistakes. Yet the lingering question remains. This caution looked less defensible earlier, when Caesar had been far weaker. Pompey had once possessed the reputation of a great soldier, and careful generals have won wars before by refusing battle. Even so, the contrast was striking. Caesar's movements remained restless, probing, and forcing decisions. Pompey's posture remained guarded, leaning on advantage rather than seizing a decisive moment. Even if the starvation strategy had merit now, it does not erase the fact that opportunities had existed to press Caesar hard when the imbalance in forces was far greater.